The human mind has a terrible habit of wandering into places it shouldn't go. Mine certainly did. I was just another burned-out journalism student at the University of Manchester, drowning in student debt and desperate for a dissertation that might actually matter. Now I'm writing this from a service station somewhere in Wales, looking over my shoulder every 30 seconds, convinced that thousands of invisible eyes are tracking my every move. And the worst part? I brought this all on myself with nothing more than curiosity and an investigation into internet urban legends that turned out to be horrifyingly real. I work at a small online news outlet in Leeds. Nothing special, just writing clickbait articles and repackaging trending stories when I'm not working on my dissertation about the dark corners of internet culture. The job barely paid the rent for my dingy flat in Headingley, which is probably why I developed an obsession with investigating internet urban legends for my dissertation. I wanted a breakthrough story, something that would get me noticed. My girlfriend used to warn me about going too deep into those rabbit holes before she moved to Edinburgh for her dream job. Now it's just me, my research notes, and too much time on my hands. The first time I accessed the dark web, it was underwhelming. Most of the sites were just marketplaces for drugs or counterfeit goods, nothing you wouldn't expect. Forums discussing privacy rights, whistleblower platforms. I was specifically researching the myth of red rooms for my thesis, supposedly live-stream torture or murder that viewers could pay to watch or even influence. Every expert I'd interviewed insisted they were just urban legends, no actual evidence of their existence. The ultimate internet boogeyman story. For 3 months I just observed, following forum threads and communicating with anonymous sources who claimed to have witnessed these broadcasts. Most were obviously lying, embellishing stories they'd heard elsewhere. I created a detailed map of these claims, tracking patterns and inconsistencies, looking for anything that might suggest truth behind the myths. I never participated in anything illegal. I just watched, collected testimonies, told myself it was all for academic research and journalism. That's when I found the first breadcrumb. It wasn't even from the dark web, but from a message board dedicated to investigating internet mysteries. A user with no posting history had responded to a thread debunking red rooms. The post contained nothing but a string of characters that looked like an encryption key. Others in the thread dismissed it as trolling, but something about it caught my attention. The format was unlike anything I'd seen before. Not a standard URL or a simple cipher. I should have left it alone. I know that now. But at the time, I convinced myself that following this lead was important for my thesis, for exposing the truth about internet urban legends. So I copied the string and spent about a week analyzing it, eventually determining it was a complex access token for a hidden service. When I finally used the key, it brought me to what looked like a waiting room, just a black page with a counter showing 9,412 and slowly ticking up. No other information, no links, no way to interact with it. I observed it for days, watching the number climb to just over 10,000 before the page suddenly changed. The new page contained only a message, observer status granted. Below it was a countdown timer set to 72 hours and a Bitcoin wallet address. The message explained that to maintain observer status, a contribution of 0.05 Bitcoin was required before the timer expired. Not a huge amount, about $1,800 at the time, but not insignificant either. I almost closed the window right then. This was clearly heading into territory I didn't want to be involved with, but a part of me, the part that couldn't stop wondering what was behind all these layers, kept the tab open. I didn't send any Bitcoin, obviously. I just watched the timer count down, curious about what would happen when it reached 0. Nothing happened when the timer expired. The page simply refreshed to show the same waiting room with the counter I'd seen before, now at around 11,000. I figured that was it. I'd been denied access for not paying and was bumped back to the beginning. Fine by me. I actually felt relieved and went to bed resolving to drop this whole exploration. The next morning, I woke up to an email from an address consisting of random characters. No subject line. The body contained only the same Bitcoin wallet address from the website and the words, "Final notice, 24 hours." I hadn't given my email to anyone. I hadn't logged into anything. There was no way they should have been able to connect my browsing to my personal email. I checked my system for malware, ran multiple scans, reviewed my network logs. Nothing unusual appeared. I changed all my passwords, enabled two-factor authentication everywhere it wasn't already active, and even reformatted my main computer. The email bothered me more than I wanted to admit, not because of the implied threat, but because it meant my security had been compromised somehow. That evening, I received a text message from an unknown number. It consisted of 5 words. "We see you, observer." I blocked the number immediately, then spent hours checking my apartment for hidden cameras or signs of intrusion. Finding nothing, I convinced myself it was just an intimidation tactic, probably automated to scare people into paying. I didn't sleep well that night, or the night after. By the 3rd day, when the 24 hours had long expired, I started to relax slightly. Nothing had happened. No more messages. I went to work, came home, ordered takeout. Normal life resumed. Until I received a package. It arrived on my doorstep with no postage or shipping label. Just a small brown box sealed with clear packing tape. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note with 7 words. From one observer to another. Your choice. I didn't plug in the drive. I'm not an idiot. Instead, I used an old air-gapped laptop to safely examine its contents. The drive contained a single video file, about 3 minutes long. The thumbnail showed what looked like a poorly lit room. I hesitated before playing it. Everything in me said not to look, but curiosity. That same damn curiosity that had started this whole thing, won out. The video showed a room with concrete walls, industrial lighting, a drain in the floor, and a person, I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, sitting in a metal chair in the center. They wore a black hood over their head and their hands were bound behind them. In the corner of the frame was a timestamp from 2 days earlier and a view counter that showed 16. In the bottom right corner was a chat window with messages scrolling by, usernames obscured. As I continued watching, frozen in horror, a figure in a featureless white mask entered the frame. They carried what looked like medical instruments on a small tray. The bound person began struggling against their restraints. The masked figure set down the tray and held up what appeared to be a scalpel to the camera, as if displaying it for the viewers. The chat window erupted with activity. The masked figure approached the bound person slowly, methodically. They placed the scalpel against the person's exposed forearm, causing them to flinch. The figure looked directly at the camera, head tilted questioningly. Then the chat window changed. A single message appeared in red text. Shallow cut, 200 USD. I stopped the video, my stomach heaving. I destroyed the laptop and the USB drive, smashed them both with a hammer, then disposed of the pieces in different dumpsters across the city. I reported the package to the police anonymously, but without more information about where it came from, I knew they couldn't do much. For weeks afterward, I lived in constant anxiety. I changed my phone number, created new email addresses, even considered moving. But nothing else happened. No more messages, no more packages. Eventually, the fear began to subside, replaced by a persistent, low-grade dread that I tried to ignore. Then, about 2 months later, I noticed something unusual on my network traffic monitor, a tool I'd been running obsessively since the incident. An unknown device was connecting to my Wi-Fi for brief periods, usually late at night. The MAC address didn't match any of my devices. I changed my network password immediately, but the device connected again the next night. I set up additional monitoring tools, trying to identify what this device was and what it was doing on my network. All I could determine was that it was accessing my network storage, specifically folders containing personal photos and documents. The next day, I came home from work to find my apartment exactly as I'd left it, except for one detail. My laptop was open. I always close it before leaving. On the screen was a photo of me, sleeping in my bed, taken the night before. In the corner of the image was that same counter I'd seen on the website months ago, now well over 20,000, and a chat window with messages I couldn't read. At the bottom of the screen, a single line of text, "Subject acquisition pending. Vote now." I packed a bag and left immediately, checked into a Travelodge under a false name, paid in cash. I called in sick to work for the next week. I considered going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I'd stumbled across something on the dark web, and now unknown people were watching me sleep? That they'd somehow compromised my devices despite all my security precautions? They'd either think I was paranoid or involved in something illegal myself. In the hotel, I spent hours researching how to disappear completely, how to create a new identity, how to live off the grid. I withdrew most of my savings in cash, bought a pay-as-you-go mobile, and started making plans to leave the country. The night before I planned to leave, I woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of my hotel room door opening. I'd engaged the safety latch before sleeping, so the door only opened a few inches before catching. Through the gap, I could see a figure standing in the hallway. They stood there for several long seconds, not moving, not trying to force the door further. Then they slipped a piece of paper through the gap and left. I waited, heart pounding, for nearly an hour before I worked up the courage to retrieve the paper. On it was printed a QR code and 3 words: "Your audience awaits." I didn't scan the code. Instead, I left immediately, abandoning most of my belongings in the hotel room. I drove non-stop for several hours, eventually reaching a small village in the Scottish Highlands where I knew no one. I paid 3 months' rent in advance for a cottage outside the village, using a different name. The place had no internet connection, which was exactly what I wanted. For the first month, I jumped at every sound. I kept the curtains drawn at all times and rarely ventured into the village. But as weeks passed, with no sign of being followed, I began to relax slightly. Maybe they'd lost interest. Maybe they'd moved on to easier targets. I found work at a local hardware shop, kept to myself, started building a new life. I bought a basic mobile but used it only for calls to work. No internet, no social media, no digital footprint. I convinced myself I was safe. Until last night. I was restocking shelves at the shop when a customer approached. A man I'd never seen before in a village where I recognized most faces by now. He asked for help finding Ethernet cables, of all things. As I led him to the correct aisle, he mentioned offhandedly that he was setting up a new security system. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. The word security system hung in the air between us. I tried to maintain my composure. asking what kind of system he was installing. He examined a package of cables, turning it over in his hands. His eyes never left the packaging as he spoke about being fascinated by observation, seeing without being seen, how some people never realize how visible they really are. I mumbled something about checking the stockroom and retreated to the back room, heart racing. It could have been an innocent conversation. It probably was, but the word choice, observation, hit too close to home. When I returned, the man was gone. In his place, on the shelf where the router cables were displayed, was a small piece of paper. On it was written a number, 57,249. Below the number was a date, 3 days from now, and the word scheduled. The counter, their audience had grown. I'm writing this now from a library computer 2 counties away. I left Scotland immediately after my shift ended yesterday. I haven't been back to the cottage. I left everything behind again. I know what you're thinking, that I'm being paranoid, seeing connections where there are none. Maybe you're right. Maybe that man was just a customer making conversation, and the paper with the number was unrelated. Maybe the entire thing, the website, the USB drive, the hotel visitor, has a rational explanation that doesn't involve what I fear it does. But I've seen the reality of what I once thought was just an urban legend. I've seen a person bound to a chair while anonymous viewers bid on what would happen to them next. I've seen how the torturer looked at the camera, waiting for instructions. I've seen my own face displayed with a scheduled date. I can feel eyes on me constantly now. I notice security cameras tracking my movements. I see people looking at their phones when I walk by, as if they're checking something, confirming something. I don't know if they're still watching because I found something I shouldn't have, or if I've become the next scheduled broadcast, the victim rather than the observer. But I know I can't keep running forever. Resources are limited, vigilance fades, mistakes happen. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I see that counter ticking upward. I wonder how many are watching at any given moment. I wonder what they're waiting to see. I wonder what amounts they'll bid to decide my fate. I never sent that Bitcoin payment, never officially subscribed to whatever service I'd stumbled across. But I'm starting to think that doesn't matter. That maybe the payment was never the point. Maybe the real currency is attention, views, engagement. The thrill of watching someone who doesn't know they're being watched until they do. I'm going to post this as a warning. Don't go looking for red rooms. Don't convince yourself it's just research or morbid curiosity. Some things once seen can't be unseen. And some things, once they see you, never look away. If you're reading this and you recognize the patterns I've described, the counters, the observer status, any of it, then you're already on their radar. And I'm sorry, I truly am, because I don't know how to make them stop watching. I'm leaving this library now. I won't say where I'm going next. I probably shouldn't have written this at all, but someone needs to know what's out there, what's happening. If you ever receive a package with no return address, or find your devices behaving strangely, or notice someone watching you just a little too intently, remember my story and start running. The counter never stops. The observation never ends. And I'm afraid that eventually they'll want more than just to watch. In 3 days, I fear 57,249 people will be tuning in to see exactly what happens to me. I always thought people who stumbled onto terrible things were careless or unlucky. Now I know better. Sometimes all it takes is one wrong click. One moment of misplaced curiosity. I'm not writing this from my flat in Bristol anymore. I'm in a budget hotel somewhere along the M4, using public Wi-Fi through multiple proxies. Not that it matters. They've proven they can find me regardless of what technical precautions I take. I have approximately 36 hours before the event they've scheduled, before I become the star of my own horror show. My life was ordinary before all this. I worked as a research assistant at a digital crime unit attached to the University of West England. Nothing glamorous, mostly compiling statistics on cyber fraud and organizing case studies for academics to analyze. I was studying for my master's in digital forensics, hoping to eventually work with the Serious Crime Directorate. The irony isn't lost on me. It started 3 months ago when I was gathering data for a paper on digital black markets. My supervisor had the proper clearances, so I had access to archives of seized dark web marketplaces. These were sanitized versions, of course, with the most disturbing content removed. I was only meant to be documenting transaction patterns for illegal goods, counterfeit currency, prescription medications, fraudulent documents, standard stuff. Nothing that would give you nightmares. I noticed something odd in the data. Transaction patterns that didn't match the documented goods. Large cryptocurrency transfers happening at scheduled times with no corresponding product listings. Just numbered slots and user counts, sometimes reaching into the thousands. The records were fragmentary since most had been redacted, but there was a pattern if you knew what to look for. My job was pattern recognition, after all. I made the mistake of asking my supervisor about these anomalies. His reaction was odd, dismissive at first, then strangely concerned. He took my notes, told me to focus on the established parameters of the research, and said he'd look into it. That should have been my first warning. The second came a week later when I found my database. Access had been quietly restricted. Curiosity is a powerful motivator, especially when combined with wounded professional pride. If I'd been sensible, I would have left it alone. Instead, I began using my personal laptop after hours, accessing Tor networks through my home internet. My reasoning was sound. How could I properly study digital black markets if I was only seeing the sanitized version? How could I contribute meaningfully to research if I didn't understand what was being hidden? I wasn't looking for anything horrible. I was looking for answers to academic questions. That's what I told myself. The dark web itself wasn't particularly shocking. Most of it was just forums and marketplaces with clunky interfaces that looked like websites from the early 2000s. What was interesting were the patterns, how users communicated, how trust was established, how transactions were verified. I created a throwaway account to observe these spaces without participating. I never bought anything, never engaged with anyone, just mapped the networks, documented the patterns, convinced myself this was still research. After weeks of observation, I began noticing references to private broadcasts and interactive experiences. These were always accompanied by significant cryptocurrency requirements and complex verification processes. Most users dismissed them as scams or urban legends. The few who claimed to have participated were vague about details, but emphatic about the authenticity of the experience. I might have left it at that if I hadn't received an unexpected email to my university account. The subject line contained a string of numbers that matched one of the transaction patterns I documented. The body contained only a .onion URL and the words, "Observer application pending." I should have reported it immediately, should have forwarded it to my supervisor and university IT security. Instead, I copied the URL to my personal laptop and accessed it that evening from home. Academic curiosity, I told myself. Need to understand the full scope of what I was researching. The site was minimalist. Black background with a simple form requesting verification. I didn't enter anything, just observed. At the bottom was a counter showing 8,731. As I watched, it ticked up to 8,732. Active viewers, I assumed. For what, I wasn't yet sure. I closed the browser and shut down my laptop, suddenly uncomfortable. The next morning, I had another email, this time to my personal account. Same subject line of numbers, but this time the message read, "Observer status approved. Verification waived. Orientation, Tuesday, 2200 hours GMT." I hadn't entered any information, hadn't provided my personal email. The rational explanation was that the university system had been compromised, and someone had connected my research queries to my personal information. I changed all my passwords, ran malware scans, and resolved to report the security breach in the morning. That night, my laptop turned itself on at precisely 10 p.m. The screen showed a loading page, then resolved to a video feed of a room. Concrete walls, harsh lighting, a metal table in the center. The video quality was poor, but clear enough to see that the room was empty except for various implements arranged on the table. In the corner of the screen was that counter again, now showing 12,416 and steadily increasing. A chat window opened on the right side of the screen. Messages scrolled by too quickly to read, but I caught phrases like "waiting for subject" and "bidding opens at acquisition." The terminology was clinical, detached. Then a message appeared, highlighted in red. "New observer identified. Location, Bristol, BS16. Confirmation required." I slammed the laptop shut and unplugged it. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped it. I considered destroying it right then, but I needed evidence of what I'd seen. Instead, I put it in a drawer and spent the night at a friend's flat, claiming a power outage at mine. In the morning, I went straight to my supervisor's office. He wasn't there. His assistant said he'd taken unexpected leave and wouldn't return for several weeks. I tried explaining the situation to the department head, but without my supervisor to confirm my research parameters, it sounded like I'd been accessing dark websites for personal reasons. I was told to take a week off and that there would be a review of my research activities. When I returned to my flat that evening, my laptop was sitting open on my desk. I'd left it in a drawer. On the screen was an image of me, taken through my own webcam, sleeping in my bed from 2 nights before. Below it was text: "Observer status revoked. Participant status pending approval. Current bids, 23 inches." I grabbed essential documents and left immediately. Checked into a hotel on the outskirts of the city. Used cash. Called in sick to both work and my classes. Used the hotel business center to email my resignation from the research position, citing personal reasons. I spent the next 3 days moving between hotels, trying to understand what was happening. I bought a burner phone, contacted a friend who worked in cybersecurity. He agreed to meet me in a public place, a busy cafe in the city center. I arrived early, chose a table with a view of both entrances. He never showed. Instead, I received a text on my new phone, which I'd given to no one except him. Meeting cancelled. Observer count 31,842. Role reassignment complete. I left my half-finished tea on the table and walked out, fighting panic. In the reflection of a shop window across the street, I noticed someone photographing me with a professional camera. When I turned to look, they were gone. That night, I dreamed of a concrete room and woke to find an envelope had been slid under my hotel room door. Inside was a plastic key card and a note with an address in Cardiff and a time, 2,000 hours tomorrow. Transport provided if required. Non-attendance will result in collection. I checked out immediately and took the first train to Edinburgh. Paid cash for another hotel. That afternoon, while walking through Princes Street Gardens, a well-dressed woman sat next to me on a bench. She placed a manila envelope between us and walked away before I could speak. Inside was a printout of my current location, time-stamped from 10 minutes earlier, and a revised schedule. Procedure delayed due to travel. New time, 2,000 hours, Thursday. View account, 47,103. Premium access sold out. I'm not writing this from Edinburgh. I moved again after that. I've been moving constantly, staying one step ahead, but they always find me. The most terrifying part is that I've never seen the same person twice. Different people leave messages, take photos, deliver reminders. It's as if there's an invisible network of watchers, all connected to whatever this is. I've pieced together what I believe is happening. The Red Rooms aren't urban legends. They're real, but not in the way most people imagine. They're not hosted on shadowy servers by mysterious organizations. They're crowdsourced horror, orchestrated through distributed networks of participants who are both observers and facilitators. Regular people who participate in the surveillance, the planning, the execution, each doing one small part, none having to bear the full moral weight of what they're contributing to. The broadcasts are carefully planned events where someone transitions from observer to subject. Sometimes it's punishment for breaking rules. Sometimes it's random selection. Sometimes it's based on viewer voting. I don't know which category I fall into. Yesterday, I received a final notification, not through email or text, but written on my bathroom mirror when I returned from getting breakfast. Broadcast scheduled. Participants en route. View account, 58,904. I left immediately, bringing only what I could carry in my pockets. No phone, no laptop, nothing that could be tracked. Yet somehow, they keep finding me. I've switched hotels twice since then. Each time I find evidence that they've been in my room. Small things moved, messages left, a countdown to my scheduled broadcast. I've considered going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I'm being hunted by an invisible network of people coordinating through the dark web? That thousands of people are waiting to watch whatever happens to me at 8 p.m. tomorrow? I have no evidence except the messages, which could easily have been self-manufactured. No witnesses. No credibility after resigning from my research position under suspicious circumstances. This morning, I found a key card in my coat pocket that I never put there. It matches the one from the envelope days ago. There was also a business card for a taxi company and a time. I think about the concrete room, the metal table, the implements. I think about the 58,904 people waiting to watch. I wonder how many of them I've passed on the street, sat next to on trains. How many hotel clerks, baristas, shop assistants are part of this network? Are they paid to participate, or do they do it for entertainment, for the thrill of being part of something secret and terrible? I keep thinking about the pattern I first noticed in those transaction records, the numbered slots, the user counts. Was I documenting my own future without realizing it? The most disturbing realization is that this system relies on ordinary people choosing to participate. Each person does one small thing, takes a photo, delivers a message, leaves a key card. None of them has to consider themselves responsible for the ultimate outcome. They're just following instructions from an app or a message board, earning cryptocurrency or credits or whatever motivates them. The horror is in the mundanity of it. I'm writing this now as a warning. I don't know if I'll be able to avoid what's scheduled for tomorrow night. I don't know if this invisible network can be evaded indefinitely. They seem to anticipate every move, have access to every system. If you're reading this and you've been researching similar topics, stop now. If you've received unexpected messages about observer status or seen unexplained counters on websites you've visited, you're already in the system. If strangers seem to know things about you they shouldn't, if you feel watched, if small objects in your home are moved when you return, run. Keep running. Trust no one. I have to move again now. The hotel clerk just called to tell me there's a package waiting at reception. I didn't order anything, didn't tell anyone where I am. The countdown shows 26 hours remaining, almost 60,000 people waiting, and somewhere, a concrete room is being prepared. The screen's blue light casts an artificial glow across my face as I hunch over my laptop in the darkness of my London flat. 3 a.m, and only the hum of my computer fan, an occasional passing car, break the silence. My fingers navigate through layers of encryption with practiced precision. The Tor browser bounces my signal across worldwide servers, wrapping me in digital anonymity. A notification pings from another tab, my banking app. Insufficient funds for an automatic payment. Again. 6 months ago, I was a mid-level IT specialist at Global Tech Marketing in Manchester. My days consisted of troubleshooting printer issues and resetting forgotten passwords for marketing executives who viewed tech support as digital janitors. Then came the redundancies, economic downturn, budget cuts, restructuring, corporate buzzwords that translated to one reality: I was expendable. The first month of unemployment wasn't unbearable. I had savings, not substantial, but enough to maintain a semblance of normalcy while I hunted for new opportunities. But as weeks stretched into months and rejection emails multiplied, my bank account dwindled alongside my sense of security. My modest flat in Dunstable transformed from sanctuary to overpriced cage, with rent consuming what little remained of my financial cushion. Last week, a pipe burst in my bathroom. The landlord took 3 days to send someone. The plumber left muddy footprints across my carpet and a bill for £180, an emergency call-out fee, not covered by the property management. That was the final straw that broke my financial back, pushing my account into overdraft territory I couldn't escape. The online forum started as mere distraction from mounting bills. Forums where anonymous users shared stories of systemic collapse, of corporate betrayal, of individuals forced to create their own safety nets when traditional ones failed them. Initially, I viewed them with skeptical detachment, digital venting spaces for the disaffected. But their voices began to resonate, talking of systems designed to fail people like me, of self-reliance in a world of broken promises, of protection against worst-case scenarios that loomed ever closer. I discovered the forum thread after my 4th job rejection in a single day. When the system fails you, create your own security. Hundreds of comments from people sharing similar stories of economic freefall. Their solutions range from cryptocurrency investments to underground bartering systems to, more disturbingly, methods of personal protection outside legal frameworks. One comment caught my attention, linking to additional resources for serious researchers only. I clicked, expecting another forum. Instead, I found detailed instructions for accessing certain marketplaces on the dark web. The comment promised nothing, suggested nothing, but the implication was clear. When conventional options fail, unconventional ones await. For 2 weeks, I merely observed. Learned. I told myself it was academic curiosity, nothing more. Just another IT professional exploring the architecture of internet underspaces. I convinced myself I was maintaining professional knowledge, not preparing, not considering, just learning. Until tonight. The dark web marketplace glows on my screen, its rudimentary interface masking sophisticated security. I'd researched for weeks before attempting access, learning about cryptocurrency transactions, PGP encryption, and unwritten rules of these shadowy corners of the internet. My cursor moves methodically through categories: drugs, counterfeit documents, hacked accounts, stolen data. I navigate past them directly to hardware, a thin euphemism for weapons. Something flickers at my window, a reflection or shadow movement. I freeze, heart suddenly racing. After 30 seconds of paralyzed vigilance, I identify the source. Just the neighbor's security light, triggering from a passing cat. The momentary panic embarrasses me, but also reinforces my purpose. This growing fear, this constant vigilance, this is precisely why I'm here. I've never owned a gun, never fired one outside a controlled range during a stag do years ago. British firearms laws had always been a distant concept, irrelevant to my daily existence, but desperation rewrites principles with remarkable efficiency. Just insurance, I tell myself. Just control in an uncontrollable life. I select a Glock 19 from a highly rated vendor, gently used. Serial number removed. The Bitcoin price equals nearly £3,000. 2 months of my remaining savings, but safety transcends price tags. The vendor's profile shows hundreds of satisfied customers, with comments alluding to smooth transactions and quality merchandise. Their response time averages under 3 hours. Their rating, perfect 5 stars across 127 transactions. Too perfect. I hesitate, cursor hovering over the contact vendor button. In legitimate marketplaces, perfect ratings trigger suspicion. Inevitable dissatisfied customers, occasional misunderstandings, shipping damages. Perfection suggests manipulation. But here I am, considering an illegal purchase from an anonymous vendor with suspiciously perfect feedback. Desperation truly is the enemy of critical thinking. A sudden power fluctuation causes my lights to dim momentarily. Another sign? A warning from the universe? Or just the aging electrical infrastructure of my building succumbing to overnight power demands? The moment passes, but leaves residual unease like static electricity on skin. I complete the encrypted form and arrange the dead drop delivery through the complex system the vendor outlines. Transaction finished. I close my laptop. A strange chill spreads through my chest, replacing the momentary surge of purpose. I've stepped beyond a boundary I never thought I'd cross. The vendor's instructions are to wait for confirmation, anywhere from hours to days. Sleep becomes a luxury. I check my encrypted email constantly, twitching at every notification. My mind conjures worst-case scenarios: police at my door, bank accounts frozen, imprisonment. The irony doesn't escape me. Seeking security has made me more paranoid than ever. At work the following day, a temporary data entry position paying barely above minimum wage, I nearly jump out of my skin when the office security guard greets me in the lobby. His casual morning sounds accusatory to my guilty conscience. I mumble a response and hurry to my windowless cubicle, where I spend the day mechanically inputting figures while compulsively checking my phone under the desk. When confirmation finally arrives 3 days later, its brevity chills me. 2 days later, detailed instructions appear. The exchange location, an abandoned industrial area outside Dunstable. Coordinates, time, 2 a.m. tomorrow. And warnings that deviating from protocol means cancellation without refund. Cash only, come alone. Follow specific routes to avoid CCTV cameras. Something about the precise nature of these arrangements triggers my first real unease. The vendor specified a meeting point that maximizes isolation. Strange for someone merely selling merchandise. A stray thought surfaces. What if the product isn't what's being valued in this transaction? I dismiss the paranoia, just nerves from crossing into illegality. That evening, I withdraw cash from scattered ATMs across town, never taking enough from any single machine to trigger reporting requirements. After the third withdrawal, my card declines. Insufficient funds. I'd miscalculated. The recent overdraft fees had reduced my available balance. Panic rises as I mentally recalculate. I'm £320 short. I return to my flat and desperately search for valuables. My watch, a gift from my father, might fetch enough at a pawn shop. I have exactly 90 minutes before shops close. The race against time leaves me sweating as I rush across town, only to receive an offer of only £280. Desperate haggling increases it to £300, still short. I empty my wallet of emergency cash, count out coins from the jar in my kitchen, and scrape together the final amount by selling my rarely used tablet to a cash converter shop just before closing. The clerk eyes me suspiciously as I anxiously check the time. His deliberate slowness in processing the transaction feels pointed, accusatory. Back at my flat, I purchase a prepaid phone, black clothing, and gloves from unfamiliar shops. Each action minimizes my digital trail. Following advice from the forums that guided me here, the prepaid phone, a basic model requiring no identification, feels alien in my hand compared to my regular smartphone. Its primitive interface reminds me of devices from a decade ago. Functional but stripped down, anonymous, disposable, like unbecoming. As I lay out these items on my bed, doubt resurfaces. The arrangement feels overtly clandestine, even for an illegal weapons purchase. The vendor's rating was perfect, suspiciously so. 5 stars across dozens of transactions, without a single complaint or issue. In legitimate marketplaces, such perfection raises red flags about fake reviews. Why had I dismissed this in a space where deception carries far deadlier stakes? My phone buzzes. My landlord threatening eviction next week if rent remains unpaid. The hesitation dissolves. This is survival. This is reclaiming control. Even if the situation feels wrong, the alternative, homelessness, complete financial ruin, seems worse. I try to sleep before the night's activities, but achieve only fragmented consciousness, jerking awake from micro-dreams where police sirens wail or shadowy figures surround my bed. Each time, I check the clock. 10:47 p.m., 11:23 p.m., 12:05 a.m. The minutes crawl with excruciating slowness until it's time to prepare. The night of the exchange arrives with a sudden drop in temperature, unseasonably cold for September. I dress in black, hide the cash in my jacket's inner pocket, and slip the prepaid phone into my jeans. I leave my regular phone behind and take precautions the forums recommended, exiting through the rear door, following a winding path to a distant bus stop, paying fare with cash. On the night bus, only 3 other passengers ride. An elderly man who appears homeless, clutching a plastic bag of possessions. A young woman with headphones staring blankly out the window, and a middle-aged man in work clothes, likely finishing a late shift. Do any of them notice me? Do any of them care about my destination or purpose? The young woman briefly makes eye contact, then returns to her window vigil. The momentary connection sends a jolt of paranoia through me. Does she know? Could she possibly suspect? Dunstable's nighttime transformation renders familiar landmarks alien and threatening. The bus carries me to the industrial district's edge, where abandoned factories loom like fossilized behemoths against the moonlit sky. As I step off the bus, my footsteps echo against concrete with unsettling clarity in the stillness. The bus pulls away, its taillights diminishing into the distance, taking with them my last connection to civilization. I am truly alone now. Or am I? A fox darts across the road ahead, freezing momentarily in my sight line before vanishing into shadows. Its sudden appearance and disappearance leaves me unnerved, heart pounding against my ribs like it might break through. I check coordinates on the prepaid phone before venturing deeper into the derelict labyrinth. Without streetlights, I use the phone's flashlight in brief bursts that compromise my night vision and heighten my unease. Each shadow-cast building could conceal watchers. Each broken window might frame observing eyes. The isolation that earlier seemed like security protocol now feels like strategic vulnerability. A sudden noise, metal scraping against concrete, freezes me mid-step. I extinguish my light and press against a wall, listening intently. Seconds stretch into a full minute of silence. Just the wind-moving debris, or something else. When no further sound follows, I proceed, but with heightened vigilance that borders on paranoia. The designated meeting point appears, a loading dock behind a former furniture factory. Rust consumes the metal railings while weeds reclaim the concrete through stubborn cracks. I arrive at 1:47 a.m. Early, but caution outweighs courtesy in these circumstances. Positioning myself in shadows beside the loading dock, I secure clear sight lines to all approaches. The night air carries distant rain and industrial decay. A metallic taste coats my tongue. Fear made physical. I suppress the urge to check the time again, knowing the screen's glow could reveal my position. Minutes pass with excruciating slowness. Each sound, distant traffic, the creaking of abandoned structures settling, the scurrying of urban wildlife triggers fresh adrenaline surges. My muscles ache from sustained tension, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. At 1:58, a notification chimes softly from my prepaid phone. The message redirects me to new coordinates, a location nearly half a mile east. My throat constricts as though invisible hands tightened around it. This wasn't in the protocol. The vendor had been explicit about adherence to original instructions, warning that deviation would result in transaction cancellation. A legitimate change would come through the same encrypted channel as our previous communications. I silence the phone and remain motionless. Either someone is attempting to redirect me, or the vendor has broken their own security practices. Neither option comforts. I consider abandoning the transaction entirely, writing off the lost Bitcoin as tuition in a harsh lesson about digital underworlds. Exactly 2 a.m., according to my watch. The vendor should appear within minutes. I scan the darkness, searching for movement, for the approaching silhouette of my contact. Nothing. The seconds tick by. 2 minutes passed. 5 minutes passed. The lengthening absence confirms my suspicion. Something has gone wrong. At precisely 2:03, movement catches my eye. A lone figure emerges between distant buildings, approaching with deliberate, measured steps. They move with unsettling confidence, not the cautious manner of someone conducting illegal business, but the assured stride of someone navigating familiar territory. Something in that walk, too controlled, too precise, sends a warning pulse through my nerves. The figure stops 20 feet from the loading dock, head tilting mechanically as they scan the area. Their face remains hidden beneath a hooded jacket, but their posture screams predator, not merchant. My instinct screams to run, but I remain frozen in shadow. The figure reaches into their pocket, withdrawing not a package, but a small device that emits a faint glow. They consult it, then turn deliberately toward my hiding spot with unnatural precision. The notification on my phone suddenly makes terrible sense. Not a competing buyer trying to divert me, but a hunter attempting to flush out prey. Perhaps even a tactic they've refined through repetition. Send unexpected instructions. Observe which hiding spots suddenly produce movement as nervous buyers check their phones. My suspicion solidifies when the figure speaks into what must be a communication device. Though too distant to hear the words, the gesture itself reveals everything. I'm not dealing with a lone seller, but an organized operation. I slide deeper into shadow, weighing impossible options. The loading dock offers no exit except past this figure. Behind me stands the facility's sealed entrance, secured with ancient chains and padlocks. The surrounding area provides no cover for a sprint to safety, only open ground where I'd be immediately spotted. A small rock dislodges from somewhere above me, clattering loudly against the loading dock's metal surface. I freeze, barely breathing, as the figure's head snaps toward the sound, toward me. Had I disturbed it unknowingly, or was this incredibly bad luck? The figure advances toward the loading dock with unnerving directness. No hesitation, no searching. They know exactly where I am. I turn to the chain doors, my only chance. The padlock is substantial, but the hasp securing it to the door has corroded over decades of neglect. I brace against the door frame and pull the chain with desperate strength. Metal groans but holds. The approaching footsteps quicken. I yank again, throwing my full weight backward. The hasp tears partially from rotted wood with a betraying screech. One final pull breaks it free. The chains slither through the handles as I slip inside, a beam of light slicing through the space I occupied seconds before. The abandoned factory's interior stretches before me, a cathedral of shadows. Moonlight filtering through broken windows reveals a vast production floor littered with debris, fallen ceiling tiles, shattered glass, remnants of human occupation. The air thickens with dust and decay, carrying the musty scent of forgotten places. My lungs protest with the urge to cough, but survival instinct suppresses the reflex. I navigate primarily by touch, putting distance between myself and the entrance. Behind me, chains rattle as my pursuer discovers my escape route. They'll follow within seconds. I need to find hiding space or another exit. My shoe connects with something solid, sending it skittering across the concrete with a betraying clatter. I freeze, listening. The entrance door creaks open. They're inside. The factory floor transitions to administrative areas, smaller rooms containing skeletal office furniture. I duck into a former manager's office with walls intact but no door. Not a hiding place, but a moment to regroup and plan. A beam of light sweeps the main floor as my pursuer enters. Their methodical movements suggest professional training or experience. No wasted motion, no hesitation. The beam pauses, then divides into 3 separate lights. Not one hunter, 3. Ice forms in my stomach. The entire transaction, the vendor profile, the gun listing, the positive reviews. All elaborate fiction designed to lure desperate people to isolated locations. But why? Robbery seems too mundane for this level of preparation. Something else drives these predators. I crouch behind a decaying desk as a light beam sweeps across the office doorway. It lingers suspiciously before continuing. They know I'm nearby. Time is evaporating. A spider descends from the ceiling directly in front of my face. I flinch involuntarily, nearly losing balance and knocking over a rusted metal bin. The near miss leaves me trembling. Even the smallest sound could now prove fatal. My eyes, adjusted to darkness, spot a ceiling access panel above. My only chance. I wait until the searching beams focus elsewhere before silently pushing the desk beneath the panel. The furniture protests with a groan, but the hunters don't immediately respond. I climb atop the desk and push against the panel. Years of undisturbed grime seal it, until it suddenly gives way. I pull myself into the crawl space just as light floods the office again. The space above the ceiling is claustrophobic and dust-filled. Each breath threatens to trigger a cough that would immediately reveal my position. I lie flat across ceiling joists, knowing the ancient tiles between them wouldn't support my weight. Below, slivers of light pierce through cracks as hunters conduct a thorough search. A persistent tickle builds in my throat, dust particles irritating sensitive tissue. I press my sleeve against my mouth, fighting the urge to cough with every fiber of my being. The pressure builds, eyes watering, chest constricting. I inch forward along the joists away from the office. The crawl space extends across several rooms until reaching the open expanse above the main factory floor. No continuing without dropping down, directly into the hunting ground. A crash echoes from the office where I entered the ceiling. They found my route. Worse, the impact destabilizes the already precarious structure. A tremor runs through the joist beneath me as dust rains downward. Stealth no longer matters, only speed. I identify a momentarily clear area below and push downward with all my strength. The ceiling disintegrates and I plummet through cascading debris. I land hard, pain shooting through my ankle. The crash creates momentary confusion as hunters converge on the collapsing ceiling. For the first time, they break silence. Sharp commands cutting through dust clouds. The voices hold no accent, just clinical efficiency in deploying resources to recapture their prey. My ankle throbs, possibly sprained, definitely damaged. Each step sends fresh waves of pain, but adrenaline pushes me forward. I limp toward a stairwell leading upward. Higher ground seems counterintuitive for escape, but they'll expect me to flee toward ground-level exits. The unpredictable path might buy precious seconds. The stairs protest beneath my weight as I ascend. Behind me, light beams become frantic in their search patterns. They've temporarily lost my trail, but won't remain confused long. Halfway up, a stair gives way beneath my foot. I pitch forward, barely catching myself on the railing. The rotted wood crumbles in my grasp. For a sickening moment, I'm suspended in space, certain I'll fall. Somehow, miraculously, my other hand finds purchase on a more solid section. I pull myself upward, heart thundering so loudly, I'm certain they must hear it echoing through the building. The second floor contains rows of empty shelving creating a maze-like structure. I navigate through them, seeking windows or roof access, while my injured ankle threatens collapse with each step. Blood pulses against my temples with such intensity, I fear they might hear it too. A sudden noise from the stairwell. Footsteps, multiple sets, ascending with deliberate caution. They found my trail again. Time evaporates like morning dew in summer heat. Moonlight spills through a broken window at the storage area's far end. Looking out reveals a partially collapsed roof section below the window. Then a 20-foot drop to the ground. Not ideal, but approaching footsteps on the stairs eliminate alternatives. I ease through the broken window onto the unstable roof section, which immediately protests under my weight. Below, discarded pallets and construction debris offer a marginally better landing than bare concrete. A flashlight beam sweeps across the storage area behind me as the roof section begins collapsing. I push off, directing my descent toward the debris pile. The impact drives air from my lungs and sends fresh pain through my ankle, but miraculously leaves me conscious and mobile. Splintered wood tears my palms as I stagger upright. I hear the roof section crash completely as I push away from the wall, forcing my damaged body into a stumbling run. The industrial complex forms a maze of derelict buildings, all potential hiding places, all potential traps. I have no plan beyond creating distance, hoping that my pursuer's determination has limits. A distant engine sounds, a vehicle approaching. Relief floods me momentarily. Civilization, witnesses, safety. But the engine cuts abruptly, followed by car doors closing with muffled precision. Not random passers-by, reinforcements. A metallic click stops me, the unmistakable sound of a round being chambered. A silhouette detaches from the shadow of a dumpster ahead. My stomach drops through ice. How had they gotten before me? I pivot only to see a second figure emerging between buildings to my left. They've herded me, using my panic against me, driving me along a predictable path while closing their net. My remaining option is a narrow alley between two warehouses. I lunge toward it despite my screaming ankle. The alley is dark and obstacle-strewn, but navigable. Behind me, I hear my pursuers control pace, unhurried. They know the alley is a dead end. Halfway down the passage, my foot catches on something, a discarded pipe or bar. I stumble, catching myself against the rough brick wall. Skin tears from my palms, adding fresh pain to my inventory of injuries. I push onward, desperation mounting with each step. After 30 yards, a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire halts my escape. Too high to climb, especially injured. I turn, back against the fence, facing my approaching hunters. Their flashlights switch off, but ambient light from distant street lamps reveals their steady advance. The lead figure stops 10 feet away, close enough to see his face beneath the hood. Young, ordinary looking, except for eyes empty of empathy or emotion. Clinical eyes that observe suffering with scientific detachment. He raises something that reflects dully in the dim light. A smartphone. On its screen, my photograph, taken from social media I deleted months ago. Beside it, information I'd believed private. My Dunstable address, employment history, bank account activity showing my deepening financial crisis, the precise amount of my overdraft, the exact figure in my savings account before redundancy, the monthly utility cost for my flat. The gun was never real. It was bait, selected based on digital breadcrumbs revealing my desperation. Everything, from forum posts resonating with my fears to the vendor's high rating, was crafted to lead me here, to this alley, to this moment. Understanding freezes my blood more effectively than fear. I wasn't randomly selected. I was profiled, studied, and targeted with the precision of commercial algorithms that determine which advertisements we see online. Except this campaign's conversion goal wasn't purchase, but capture. The young man pockets the phone and withdraws a real gun from his jacket. Behind him, the second hunter raises what I now recognize as a camera, its recording light blinking steadily. The third blocks any slim hope of escape. The details of my financial life appear on a device screen. My monthly internet costs, my VPN subscription fee, the precise amounts withdrawn from cash machines across Dunstable over the past week. They've catalogued my desperation in sterile spreadsheet format, treating my gradual economic collapse as clinical data points. They hadn't just tracked my digital movements. They'd invaded every aspect of my digital life. The leader aims at my chest with mechanical precision. The camera adjusts position slightly, framing the scene with professional detachment. This isn't just execution, it's production. Another device appears displaying video footage. A man trapped exactly as I am now, backed against a fence. Comprehension dawning across his features. The timestamp shows last month's date. The footage ends with a muzzle flash. I straighten against the fence. In my final clarity, I understand my fatal error. I hadn't sought a weapon. I'd unknowingly auditioned for a role. Every digital breadcrumb I'd dropped had marked me not as consumer, but as commodity. Not customer, but content. My desperation wasn't vulnerability to be exploited. It was the precise quality they'd been hunting. A distant siren wails, police or ambulance, impossible to determine. For a fleeting moment, hope flickers, but the hunters don't even glance toward the sound. They know response times to this abandoned district. They've calculated their window precisely. The gun barrel aligns with my chest. I close my eyes, refusing to give them the satisfaction of capturing my fear. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I hear the soft exhalation of the leader's breath as his finger tightens on the trigger. The gunshot echoes through the Dunstable industrial wasteland, transforming from a single report into a cacophony that seems endless. The bullet tears through me, and as consciousness fades, my final thought is of my laptop, still glowing in my empty flat, the digital gravestone I carved with my own desperate keystrokes. The hunters pack their equipment with practiced efficiency. They've captured what they came for, another episode in their macabre series. The footage will be edited, enhanced, distributed to subscribers who pay premium rates for authentic content. My death will be categorized, tagged, and monetized. British male, 34, IT professional, financial distress, Dunstable location. In the digital marketplace where I thought I was the customer, I was always the product. My body grows cold in the alley, while somewhere in the darkest corners of the internet, a vendor account updates its perfect rating statistics, maintaining immaculate credibility to lure the next desperate soul seeking security in an insecure world. My story becomes data, content, entertainment, another digital artifact in an endless archive of human vulnerability exploited for profit and pleasure. The cycle continues, invisible to those who haven't yet reached the level of desperation, where safeguards and skepticism crumble before basic survival needs. The hunters disappear into the night, leaving nothing but cooling blood and a cautionary tale that will never be told. By morning, my body will be gone, erased as thoroughly as my digital footprint will be sanitized. No connection between the unemployed IT specialist and the content newly available in exclusive subscription-only forums. The marketplace listing remains active. The Glock 19 still displays as available, its perfect reviews enticing the next desperate soul who believes they're purchasing security rather than auditioning for annihilation. The digital hunt continues, endless and invisible, harvesting those who have fallen through society's cracks into a shadow economy where they are no longer consumers, just consumables. 2 days later, an email arrives in my former manager's inbox. A job application for a position similar to mine from someone whose employment history, financial situation, and recent online behaviors fit a familiar profile. The cycle begins anew. Another target identified, another hunt initiated. In the darkest corners of the internet, where desperation meets opportunity, the predators continue to feed, invisible to all but their carefully selected prey. It's strange what a simple dare can lead to. They say curiosity killed the cat, but no one tells you about the part where the cat spends months afterward looking over its shoulder, jumping at shadows, and sleeping with one eye open. I've debated sharing this for almost a year now. My therapist thinks it would help to externalize the experience, but I can't bring myself to tell her the whole story. Some things you just can't explain to someone whose darkest online experience is probably accidentally clicking on a pop-up ad. So I'm writing it here instead, anonymously, maybe as a warning, maybe just to convince myself it really happened. Everything started last autumn, during that weird limbo week between Christmas and New Year, when time seems to lose all meaning. I was staying at my flat in Leeds, rather than going home to my parents in Newcastle, partly because train tickets were ridiculously expensive, and partly because I needed some time alone after a rather messy breakup in early December. My flatmate had gone to his girlfriend's for the holidays, so I had the place to myself, just me, a stack of leftover Christmas chocolates, and an endless stream of mediocre content on Netflix. I was slouched on our sagging sofa one evening, laptop balanced precariously on my stomach, mindlessly scrolling through social media while some forgettable crime documentary played in the background. The radiator was making that annoying ticking sound it always did when it was heating up, and I could hear the neighbors upstairs, apparently rearranging their furniture for the 5th time that week. My phone buzzed with a message from my friend Alex. We'd known each other since 6th form and still kept in regular contact despite ending up at different universities. Alex and I had this ongoing thing where we dare each other to try increasingly bizarre internet challenges or explore strange online rabbit holes. It had started years ago with innocent stuff like spend an hour on Wikipedia following random links and see where you end up, but it gradually evolved into more obscure corners of the internet. Nothing illegal, just weird, odd forums, bizarre YouTube channels, that sort of thing. His message that night was different though. He was daring me to explore the dark web. He'd sent me a link to a tutorial on how to set it up safely, along with some starting points. Apparently, he tried it himself the previous week. I remember hesitating, my thumb hovering over the link. I knew what the dark web was, of course. That hidden part of the internet not accessible through normal browsers, often associated with illegal activities, but also used by people in countries with heavy internet censorship or journalists protecting sources. I should mention I was studying computer science, specializing in network security. So there was a part of me that was professionally curious about how these hidden networks functioned. I told myself it would be educational, a practical application of the theory we'd covered in class. That's how I justified it anyway, though in reality, it was probably more about not wanting to back down from a dare and having absolutely nothing better to do with my evening. I followed the tutorial, downloading the special browser needed to access .onion sites, setting up a VPN for an extra layer of security, all the recommended precautions. I remember the heating had kicked in properly by then, making the flat almost uncomfortably warm. I'd peeled off my Christmas jumper, an ironic one with a dinosaur wearing a Santa hat, and was just in a t-shirt, the fabric sticking slightly to my back. There was a half-empty mug of tea on the coffee table, long gone cold. Outside, it had started to rain, droplets pattering against the window in that soothing, rhythmic way that usually made me sleepy. But I wasn't sleepy. There was a nervous energy buzzing through me as I waited for the browser to connect, a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The boring documentary had ended, replaced by something equally forgettable that served as white noise in the background. The browser finally connected, and I was in. At first glance, it was anticlimactic. just a different browser with a search engine that looked more basic than what I was used to. Alex had sent me some beginner links, mostly forums discussing privacy and technology, nothing particularly sinister. I browsed for about an hour, finding it interesting, but not especially shocking. Most of it was stuff you could find on the regular internet if you knew where to look. I was almost disappointed, having expected something more dramatic based on the dark web's reputation. That's when I made my first mistake. Instead of sticking to the links Alex had sent, I decided to follow some of the links I found on those forums, curious to see where they led. Each new site had more links, and I kept following them, going deeper and deeper into this hidden network. It was like pulling on a loose thread and watching an entire garment unravel. I noticed the tone of the sites changing subtly. The discussions moved from privacy and technology to more questionable topics. How to acquire false identification. Discussions about substances and services that were clearly illegal. I should have stopped then. Should have closed the browser and gone back to my mindless Netflix scrolling. But there's a strange momentum to exploration like this. Each new discovery makes you wonder what else is hiding just one more link away. I remember shifting position on the sofa, my back starting to ache from being hunched over for so long. The rain had intensified, now hammering against the windows, and the wind had picked up, making the old frames rattle. My cold tea had developed that unappealing skin on top that always made me shudder. The flat suddenly felt too quiet despite the background noise of the TV and the storm outside. It was approaching midnight when I found it. I'd been following a particularly convoluted chain of links, each site more disturbing than the last. I'd gone from marketplace sites selling illegal items to forums discussing things I won't repeat here. The link was embedded in a post on one of those forums. No description, just a string of random characters ending in .onion. I hovered over it, finger poised on the trackpad. Some part of my brain was sending warning signals, like when you're about to touch something that might be hot. I should have listened to that instinct. Instead, I clicked. The page that loaded was unlike the others. Most dark web sites I'd seen were basic, with minimal graphics and simple layouts, function over form. This one had a sleek, almost professional design. Black background, crimson text, a layout that reminded me of auction sites like eBay, but with a far more ominous aesthetic. At the top of the page was a logo, just a simple red circle, and below it the words, "The Crimson Room bidding now open." I frowned, trying to figure out what kind of auction site this was. There were no product images, just listings with numbers and brief descriptions that made little sense to me at first glance. Each listing had a timer counting down and a current bid amount. The amounts were substantial, thousands in Bitcoin. It took me several minutes of confused browsing to understand what I was looking at, and when realization dawned, it hit me like a physical blow. These weren't products being auctioned, they were people. Each listing included basic details, age, gender, location, and a description of what would happen to them depending on which package received the highest bid. My stomach clenched, a wave of nausea washing over me. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of elaborate roleplay, a sick fantasy site where nothing actually happened. I tried to convince myself of this as I scrolled through the listings, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then I noticed a section labeled Previous Events. I clicked it, though every instinct was screaming at me not to. It contained archives of past sessions, thumbnails that you could click to access recordings. My cursor hovered over one, trembling slightly. Again, that voice in my head begging me not to click. Again, my curiosity overriding it. The video that loaded was grainy but clear enough. I managed about 30 seconds before slamming my laptop shut, rushing to the bathroom, and vomiting until there was nothing left but bile. What I'd seen wasn't fake. The terror in that person's eyes, the sounds they made despite being gagged. There's a quality to genuine fear that can't be acted, can't be faked. And the clinical, almost bored manner of the masked figure carrying out the requests, it was real. All of it was real. I sat on the cold bathroom floor for what felt like hours, shaking uncontrollably. The storm outside had reached its peak, rain lashing against the window, wind howling through the gaps in the frames. Every noise made me flinch. My mind kept replaying those 30 seconds, unable to process that human beings could do such things to each other, that other human beings would pay to watch or direct it. Eventually, I managed to pull myself together enough to return to the living room. My laptop sat on the sofa where I'd left it, closed but somehow threatening, as if what I'd seen might leak out from between the keys. I needed to report this to the police, to someone who could do something about it. But what could I actually tell them? I had no specific information about where these events were taking place, who was running the site, or who the victims were. And I'd have to admit to accessing the dark web, to following link after link, until I found something so profoundly disturbing. I decided to go back, just long enough to gather some information that might be useful to authorities. This was my second mistake. I opened the laptop, steeling myself against what I might see. The browser was still connected, the site still open. I began taking screenshots, noting down any details that might help identify the location or the people involved. I was so focused on this self-appointed mission that I didn't notice it at first, the small notification that had appeared in the corner of the screen. When I finally saw it, my blood ran cold. A private message from an account named Admin. The message was simple. They had detected unusual activity from my connection, specifically the taking of screenshots. They had my IP address, despite the VPN, which had apparently failed at some point. They knew my approximate location, and they were sending someone to discuss my interest in their services. I slammed the laptop shut again, yanked out the power cord, and pulled the battery for good measure. Then I grabbed my phone and keys and ran out of the flat without even stopping for a jacket, despite the storm raging outside. I spent that night at a 24-hour cafe in the city center, jumping at every person who entered, convinced they had been sent to find me. In the harsh light of morning, huddled over my 5th cup of coffee, I tried to rationalize what had happened. It was probably just an automated message designed to scare people who stumbled across the site. They wouldn't really send someone after a random person who had accidentally found their operation. That would draw attention, create risk. It wasn't logical. This rationalization helped me function enough to return to my flat, pack a bag, and go straight to the train station. I spent the remaining holiday with my parents, making excuses about missing home. I didn't touch my laptop again until I was back at university, and when I did, I completely wiped it and reinstalled everything from scratch. I never reported what I'd seen. The fear of not being believed, of somehow being implicated, was too great. And deep down, there was a more terrifying thought. What if reporting it led them back to me? What if they had connections in law enforcement? It seemed paranoid, but after what I'd seen, my understanding of what people were capable of had fundamentally changed. For weeks afterward, I was certain I was being watched. I took different routes home from lectures, avoided being alone when possible, and slept with a chair propped against my bedroom door. I kept seeing the same car parked near our flat, a black sedan with tinted windows. Probably a coincidence, but it was enough to make me move out mid-semester, finding a new place on the other side of the city. The fear has faded somewhat with time. I no longer jump at every unexpected sound or suspect every stranger of being sent to silence me. I've almost convinced myself that the message was just an automated scare tactic. Almost. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night and the wind is rattling the windows, I remember what I saw. I remember that somewhere out there right now, those auctions are still happening. People are still bidding, still watching, still directing. And I know something else too. They have my information. Maybe they've forgotten about me, filed me away as an insignificant breach not worth pursuing. Or maybe they're just waiting for the right moment. I changed my number, my email addresses, even my name on social media. I've moved twice more since then, but in my darker moments, I wonder if it's enough. The internet never forgets, and neither do the people who lurk in its darkest corners. Last week, I received a plain envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name and current address. An address I've only had for 3 months. Inside was a blank sheet of paper with a small red circle drawn in the center. I'm leaving the country next week. Exchange program to Australia, as far away as I can get. I haven't told anyone where I'm going except my parents and the university administration. This will be my last post online anywhere, under any name. If you're reading this, don't make the same mistakes I did. Some curiosities aren't worth satisfying. Some dares aren't worth accepting. And some corners of the internet should remain unexplored. I think there's someone outside my window. I can see a shadow moving across the garden. It's probably just a neighbor, or maybe a fox, but I'm not taking any chances. I still can't look at a vegetable garden without seeing her face. Pale and perfect, surrounded by winter greens, planted like she belonged there. Emily was 24 years old when she disappeared. 24 years old when I photographed her body among the carrots and parsnips. 24 years old, and she'll never be 25. My name is Daniel. I'm a crime scene photographer for Thames Valley Police. And I'm about to tell you about the case that destroyed the peace in our quiet English village. About the man who buried a beautiful young woman in a community garden. About how someone who waved to you at the post office on Tuesday could be committing unimaginable acts on Wednesday, and how none of us saw it coming. It started on a bitter January morning in 2018. The kind of English winter day where the fog never quite lifts and everything feels damp right down to your bones. I remember scraping ice off my windscreen when the call came in. Something found at the Millfield Lane allotments. Suspicious circumstances. Attend with camera equipment. I'd been with Thames Valley Police for 15 years by then, documenting everything from domestic disputes gone wrong to drunk driving fatalities. I'd seen my share of death, learned to separate myself from it professionally. At least, that's what I told myself. My wife Emma says differently. Says I started going grey the year I joined the force, that I sometimes cry out in my sleep. She's probably right. You can't stare into the abyss without it staring back, as they say. The Millfield allotments have been part of Lower Barton since the war years. 78 little patches of earth where locals grow everything from prize roses to potatoes. My own granddad had a plot there until his arthritis got too bad. I'd spent countless childhood Saturdays helping him weed, mostly eating fresh peas straight from the pod when he wasn't looking. I knew every gravel path and garden shed by heart. But I'd never seen it like this, crawling with police, forensic tents gleaming white against the winter-dead landscape. Helena, our detective chief inspector, met me at the tape, her face grim. She'd grown up one village over, understood the impact this would have. Mid-40s, with short silver-streaked hair and the focused intensity of someone who'd clawed her way up through the ranks when female detectives were still a novelty in rural forces. Her expression told me everything I needed to know. This was bad. Emily lay in plot 23, as if she'd been tucked in for the night, not buried in frozen soil. 24 years old, doctoral student at Cambridge, environmental researcher with a promising future. Missing for 17 days after staying late at the university library. Her body had been arranged with unnerving care, like a gardener setting a delicate plant. Winter vegetables, carrots, parsnips, Brussels sprout stalks, circled her in perfect rings. Someone had washed her hair clean under her fingernails. Someone had treated her like a prize specimen. I knew Emily, not well, but enough to recognize her immediately. She'd grown up in Lower Barton, daughter of the local doctor. I'd photographed her graduating sixth form, covered the charity fun run she'd organized last summer for the village newsletter. She'd been back living with her parents while finishing her PhD thesis on soil microbiomes and sustainable agriculture. The irony of where she was found wouldn't escape anyone. The soil around her was meticulously tended, not a weed in sight, despite the winter dormancy. Each vegetable was spaced with mathematical precision, creating concentric circles around her body. The carrots formed the innermost ring, their feathery tops brushing against her shoulders. Parsnips came next, then Brussels sprouts on their tall, alien-looking stalks. In the weak January sunlight, with morning frost still glittering on the leaves, it almost looked beautiful. That was perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. I remember the clicks of my camera shutter sounding obscenely loud in the hush that had fallen over the scene. Click, evidence marker by her right hand. Click, the pattern of vegetables. Click, her face, peaceful in a way that death rarely allows. Each image burned into my memory as permanently as onto the memory card. The post-mortem revealed the worst part. Soil in her lungs meant she'd still been breathing, however weakly, when placed in the earth. I've photographed hundreds of crime scenes, but that detail still haunts my dreams. The sensation of soil filling your mouth as consciousness fades. The pathologist estimated she'd been dead approximately 2 weeks, putting her death shortly after her disappearance. No sexual assault, no defensive wounds. Toxicology showed nothing unusual. She'd simply vanished from a busy university library and reappeared, buried in the fertile soil of her hometown. Emily had last been seen on a Tuesday evening in early January, working late at the Cambridge University Library. CCTV footage showed her leaving around 10:30 p.m., walking toward the bus station with her backpack slung over one shoulder. The heavy winter coat she wore was the same one her parents identified later, dark blue, knee-length, with a fur-trimmed hood. In the footage, she'd pulled the hood up against the light rain. Her face was barely visible, just a flash of profile as she passed under a streetlight. The last confirmed sighting came from a night bus driver who remembered dropping her at the village crossroads around 11:45 p.m. She'd been a regular on his route, always polite, always with a book or laptop open on night journeys. That evening, she'd been one of only 3 passengers. He remembered her getting off, turning toward the footpath that would take her through the village green, a shortcut home that she'd walked hundreds of times. Her parents reported her missing the next morning when they realized she hadn't come home. Her bed was undisturbed. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her laptop still sat in her university locker. A missing persons case was open, but there was little to go on. No enemies, no troubled relationships, no history of mental health issues or dangerous behaviors. Just a bright young woman who vanished on a rainy January night. The strangest thing, Plot 23 didn't belong to anyone. It had been vacant since old Arthur died 3 months earlier. The allotment committee had suspended new assignments due to some administrative issue with the council. Someone had been tending it anyway, hiding in plain sight among legitimate gardeners. Someone who knew the allotments well enough to avoid attention. Lower Barton is tiny, population under 9,000, the kind of place where the biggest news is usually someone's prize marrow at the village show. The kind of place where people leave doors unlocked and know the names of neighbors' dogs. That changed overnight. Suddenly, we were the village where Emily was found. The village where young women shouldn't walk alone. Emily's parents were destroyed. I didn't photograph their identification of the body. Another officer handled that. But I saw them leaving the morgue. 2 people physically bent by grief, holding each other up like damaged trees after a storm. The entire village felt their pain. Emily had been universally liked. Bright, kind, always quick with a smile or an offer to help. Memorial flowers appeared spontaneously by the allotment entrance. The primary school where she'd volunteered closed for a day of remembrance. I remember walking home from the scene that first day. The weight of my camera bag seemingly doubled. Neighbors who would normally greet me with casual waves were now gathering in doorways, expressions anxious, voices hushed as they exchanged theories and concerns. The street where Emily had grown up was lined with cars as friends and family arrived to support her parents. A media van was already parked discreetly at the end of the road, a reporter doing a piece to camera with the village green deliberately blurred behind her. Helena ran the investigation by the book. Door-to-door inquiries, allotment holder interviews, CCTV reviews from every shop and traffic camera within 10 miles. A dedicated tip line that rang constantly with locals reporting suspicious characters who usually turned out to be delivery drivers or visitors from neighboring villages. Officers combed through Emily's life looking for anyone who might have wished her harm. Her professors, her former boyfriends, the barista at her favorite coffee shop. But nothing suspicious emerged. Emily had been well liked, uncontroversial, without enemies. The press nicknamed the killer the gardener, and the case became national news. Emily's face, always the same photo of her laughing at her brother's wedding, appeared on every front page. I watched my hometown transform on live television, the drone footage making our familiar streets look sinister and exposed. News vans parked outside the Crown, our local pub. Journalists buying rounds for anyone willing to speak on camera about the quiet village rocked by tragedy, or the brilliant young scientist taken too soon. Some embraced the attention, most resented it. At home, Emma installed new locks on our doors and windows. She'd never bothered before, despite my job. Now she double-checked them before bed, started keeping her phone charged by her pillow. We have no children, couldn't have them, as it turned out. But I wonder how parents coped during those weeks, what lies they told to explain the sudden restrictions, the constant supervision. In the days following Emily's discovery, I was assigned to document every inch of the allotments, each of the 78 plots photographed in detail, each shed, compost bin, and water butt examined for evidence. Each pathway walked with eyes trained on the ground for footprints, fibers, anything the killer might have left behind. I photographed hundreds of soil samples collected by forensic teams, each carefully labeled with location coordinates. The allotments revealed themselves to me in ways I'd never noticed before, despite growing up in their shadow. The careful organization of some plots versus the cheerful chaos of others. The handmade trellises and improvised coal frames. The different gardening philosophies expressed in layout choices and plant selections. And plot 23, unnervingly perfect in its precision. A demonstration garden rather than a working one. A stage set for a performance that only the killer understood. 3 weeks passed. Leads went nowhere. The initial shock began fading into uneasy routine. Officers from other districts were gradually reassigned. Helena looked increasingly haggard during our morning briefings, the pressure from above mounting as the case stalled. Emily's parents issued a heart-wrenching appeal for information. A £50,000 reward was offered by an anonymous local businessman. University friends organized a memorial scholarship in her name. Then came the first real break. A pensioner who walked his terrier around the perimeter of the allotments each morning reported seeing someone in plot 23 well before dawn several times in the weeks before Emily disappeared. Too dark to see clearly, just a figure working by torchlight. He hadn't thought anything of it. Many gardeners visited at odd hours, especially those with full-time jobs. But when questioned about specific dates, his calendar showed dog-walking notes that placed the nocturnal gardener in plot 23 3 days before Emily vanished, and again the day after. The forensic team returned to the plot with renewed focus. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed no other bodies were buried there. Microscopic examination of soil samples showed traces of chemical fertilizers not commonly used in home gardening, but found in professional landscaping. Fiber evidence included threads from high-end outdoor clothing brands, and most importantly, a partial boot print preserved in dried mud near the water tap. Size 9 Wellington boots with a distinctive tread pattern. Sold by only 3 retailers in Cambridgeshire. Cross-referenced with purchase records, residence proximity, and horticultural knowledge, one name floated to the top. Edward, 46, landscape gardener, Lower Barton resident for 4 years. I knew him, not well, but enough to nod hello at the shop. He'd redesigned the planting beds outside the community centre the previous spring. Quiet man, efficient, particular about his work. Always wore those dark green wellies, even when not gardening. Said they were the most comfortable footwear he'd found. He lived in a modest cottage on the village outskirts. Slate roof, wisteria climbing the south wall, impeccable front garden with precisely trimmed box hedges and gravel paths, without a stone out of place. The kind of home featured in weekend supplements about rural idylls. Quiet, polite, unremarkable. He volunteered at community events, nodded to neighbours but rarely conversed. The perfect background presence, forgettable by design. When investigators began digging into Edward's background, curious patterns emerged. He'd moved around frequently throughout his career, never staying in one place more than 5 years. His references were impeccable, but difficult to verify. Previous employers had retired, moved abroad, or businesses had closed. His landscape business operated primarily through word of mouth, with minimal paper trail. His financial records showed modest income, but surprising savings. A man who lived simply, but with attention to detail. Most disturbing was his connection to Emily. He'd redesigned the gardens at the medical practice where her father worked. He'd been contracted to advise on sustainable landscaping at Cambridge University's Environmental Science building where Emily studied. He'd even worked briefly at the community gardens near the bus stop where she'd last been seen. Their paths had crossed multiple times, yet no one had connected them until now. The surveillance operation lasted 3 days. Edward followed a predictable routine, worked during daylight hours, home by 6, rarely going out except to purchase groceries or visit his elderly mother in a care home in Cambridge. He attended church sporadically, volunteered for the occasional community event, kept himself to himself. So ordinary he became invisible. Yet there were anomalies. Late-night lights in his garden shed, frequent trips to remote nurseries for specialized plant specimens, an unusual number of gardening tools, far more than any professional would need, and most notably, no clients during the winter months, despite his financial records showing consistent income year-round. I wasn't part of the arrest team, but I saw the footage later. 6 officers approaching the cottage at dawn. Edward opening the door in pajamas and dressing gown, looking puzzled but not alarmed. No resistance, no dramatic scenes. Just a man calmly turning around to be handcuffed, asking with his eyes if he could put proper clothes on first. The search warrant revealed nothing immediately suspicious in his home. Gardening journals, plant photographs, certificates from horticultural courses, an organized Spartan existence. Then they found the cellar entrance behind a bookshelf in his kitchen, activated by removing a specific volume of the Complete Guide to Organic Gardening. The space below contained glass jars filled with soil samples, labeled by location and date, hundreds of jars, thousands, a meticulous catalogue of earth from across Cambridgeshire and beyond. Some dated back 20 years to places Edward had previously lived, each carefully labelled, organised by region, soil type, pH level. In the centre stood a workbench of polished oak. On it, a leather-bound journal filled with Edward's handwriting, neat, precise, almost architectural in its clarity. Pressed flowers marked certain entries. My hands shook as I photographed pages describing the transplanting of Emily, her preparation, the monitoring for signs of successful taking. The journal detailed his first noticing Emily at a university lecture on sustainable agriculture he'd attended as a continuing education requirement for his landscaping certification. He'd been struck by her questions about soil microbiomes, her understanding of mycorrhizal networks, her passion for the hidden life beneath the surface. He'd followed her research, read her published papers, attended more lectures where she spoke. In his distorted mind, she wasn't an object of desire, but a necessary component, the perfect human element to complete his experimental garden. Edward wrote of integrating humans into the growth cycle, of cellular transfer between people and plants. Emily wasn't simply murdered. She was, in his distorted mind, transformed into a hybrid plant-human entity that would enrich the soil. He described watching her for weeks, learning her routines, planning the optimal transplantation, with the care of a gardener preparing a delicate specimen for a new environment. The journal described their first direct interaction on the night she disappeared. He'd offered her a lift from the bus stop, recognizing her from lectures, presenting himself as a local landscaper interested in her research. The heavy rain had made his offer seem reasonable. She'd accepted, not recognizing him as the quiet man who occasionally tended her father's office gardens. His entry noted her intelligent conversation during the short drive and his regret at the necessary chemical intervention when he'd used chloroformed cloth as they approached his cottage instead of her home. One entry about Emily read that she showed promising signs of integration with surrounding specimens. Root structures appeared drawn to established position. He would monitor for evidence of nutrient exchange. Temperature remained suboptimal, but necessary given circumstances. No visible surface manifestation yet. He had been returning to the burial site regularly, checking for signs of some transformation that existed only in his mind. The vegetables planted around her body weren't symbolic. They were intended to be recipients of some imagined essence transferred from human to plant. In his twisted logic, he was creating a new form of hybrid existence. The most chilling discovery came in a small refrigerator hidden beneath the workbench. Inside, soil samples taken from directly beneath Emily, carefully dated and labeled Specimen E Day 1, Specimen E Day 7, and so on. Edward had been conducting regular biopsies of the soil surrounding Emily, searching for evidence of the transformation he believed was occurring. Microscopic analysis later showed these samples contained decomposition products. He had been scientifically documenting the natural processes of decay, interpreting them as signs of his imagined transformation. More disturbing still were the plans for future specimens found in a hidden compartment beneath the workbench. 5 more names, 5 more people who had unwittingly entered Edward's orbit, been catalogued for his grotesque garden, each with detailed notes about their routines, vulnerabilities, and optimal transplantation locations based on soil composition and sunlight patterns, each with a specific vegetable pairing chosen to maximize nutrient transfer potential, each with a timeline for harvesting that would have begun the following spring. Edward offered no resistance during arrest, expressed no remorse during questioning, appeared genuinely bewildered that his research was considered criminal. During one interview, which I watched through one-way glass, he patiently explained to Helena that his work would revolutionize our understanding of the human-plant relationship, and offered to provide detailed notes to help scientists continue his research. Psychiatric evaluation found him suffering from a rare delusional disorder, possibly exacerbated by long-term exposure to certain agricultural chemicals found in his workshop. Further investigation revealed a family history of schizophrenia that he'd concealed, and evidence of a head injury sustained in his 20s that had never been properly treated. He was deemed unfit for trial and committed to Ravenswood Secure Hospital, where he reportedly tends the therapeutic garden with the same meticulous care he showed Emily. The press had a field day. "The gardener unmasked," screamed the headlines. Photos of Edward, always the same one, taken at a community fete where he'd won prizes for his tomatoes, plastered every front page. Journalists descended again on Lower Barton, this time hunting for neighbors who'd known him, trying to extract every detail of his quiet existence. His cottage became a macabre attraction, forcing police to maintain a cordon until interest finally waned. Emily's family retreated from public view. Their grief, so publicly displayed during the search, became private again once answers were found. They sold their home 6 months later, moving to Scotland to be near relatives. I sometimes wonder if they found peace there, away from the soil that had claimed their daughter. I hope so. The aftermath was almost worse than the investigation. The questions nobody could answer satisfactorily. How had we not known? How had we not seen? How had someone so profoundly disturbed lived among us undetected? The self-recrimination, the suspicion that lingered even after Edward was gone, the uncomfortable knowledge that evil had walked our streets wearing the most ordinary face imaginable. Lower Barton's healing began slowly. The allotments reopened, though many plot holders surrendered their tenancies, unable to face the soil that had concealed Emily. Plot 23 was transformed into a memorial garden, Emily's favorite flowers instead of vegetables. a wooden bench was installed at the allotment entrance, bearing her name and the simple epitaph, "She grew in our hearts." Helena received an official commendation for solving the case, though the toll it took was visible in the new lines on her face, the streak of grey that hadn't been there 6 months earlier. She transferred to headquarters the following year, moved into administrative work. We still meet occasionally for coffee. Neither of us mentions the case directly, but it sits between us like a third presence. Emma and I considered moving away. Many did, but Lower Barton is home, has been for generations of my family. Running away wouldn't erase the memories. Instead, we adopted a dog, a rescue Springer Spaniel named Bella, who gets me out walking every day, even when I'd rather hide indoors. Her uncomplicated joy in simple things has been its own form of therapy. The village appears normal now, 5 years later. The shop still sells local honey and homemade cakes. The pub quiz happens every Thursday. Children still play in the park. But beneath the surface runs the knowledge that evil grew among us undetected, that it presented as ordinary as a man with soil-stained hands who nodded good morning at the shop, that it existed season after season until circumstance brought it to light. I still photograph gardens sometimes, though not professionally. The ordered rows and careful spacing remind me that precision isn't inherently malevolent, that the same attention to detail cultivates beauty and nourishment just as easily as horror. I grow tomatoes in our back garden. Emma says it's my way of reclaiming something Edward tainted. She's probably right. She usually is. What remains unclear is whether Edward was an anomaly or a warning, whether his delusion was unique or an extreme version of humanity's complicated relationship with nature, whether, in our quest to control and cultivate the natural world, we risk cultivating something darker within ourselves. The allotments continue their seasonal cycle. Winter vegetables give way to spring greens, give way to summer abundance, give way to autumn harvest. The soil accepts what is planted without judgment or memory. New gardeners tend plots where Emily once lay, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what happened beneath their hands. Life continues, growth continues. But whenever I drive past the Millfield Lane allotments, I remember Emily's face among the winter vegetables. I remember the quiet gardener who believed humans were simply another crop to cultivate. And I check my door locks twice before sleeping, because some harvests once reaped can never be undone. I didn't know her name at the time. I didn't even know someone had gone missing. All I knew was that something felt wrong in that place, and I couldn't explain why. It's only now, years later, that I understand what I walked into, and I wish I hadn't. This was back in 2019. I was 22 and working part-time at a small garage just outside Shaftesbury, Dorset, the sort of town where nothing ever really happens, where you know the faces at the pub and the dog walkers by name. My job wasn't glamorous, but it kept the lights on. Most of the time, I'd change tires, fix radiators, and argue with pensioners about MOT advisories. My name's Jamie Harlow. I've lived in Shaftesbury all my life, born at Salisbury District Hospital, schooled at Shaftesbury Comprehensive, and never quite managed to leave. Not for lack of trying, mind you. I'd always dreamed of moving to Bristol or Manchester, somewhere with a pulse, but life has a way of keeping you rooted to familiar soil. My mum got sick when I was 19, breast cancer that had spread before anyone caught it, and by the time she passed, I'd already settled into the rhythm of small-town existence. My father had left when I was 11, sent Christmas cards for the first 2 years, then nothing. Last I heard, he was somewhere in Spain, with a woman half his age. The garage I worked at, Tanner's Auto Repair, sat at the edge of town where the A350 curves toward Warminster. Old Jeff Tanner had owned it for 30 years. His arthritis had gotten bad, so he'd hired me to handle the heavy lifting. The pay wasn't much, but Jeff was decent. Let me use the tools after hours to keep my own rust bucket Fiesta running. It wasn't the career I'd imagined growing up, but it was something. One Tuesday night, just after closing, a bloke in his 30s came in looking soaked and out of breath. Claimed he'd gotten his car stuck in the mud up near Winkham Lane, which didn't surprise me. Those country lanes get treacherous when it rains. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the surrounding countryside into a sodden patchwork of waterlogged fields and overflowing drainage ditches. The forecast promised another week of the same. The man stood dripping on the workshop floor, water pooling around his mud-caked boots. Average height, medium build, with close-cropped brown hair and the beginning of a receding hairline. Nothing remarkable about him, the kind of face you'd forget in a crowd. He wore a navy waterproof jacket over a plain white t-shirt, jeans, and those boots that were almost black with mud. What struck me most was the way his eyes never seemed to settle, darting around the garage like he was taking inventory or looking for escape routes. He was twitchy, kept glancing over his shoulder, but I chalked it up to nerves. He said he'd been out for a drive, took a wrong turn, and skidded into a ditch. His story seemed plausible enough. Tourists were always getting lost on the back roads, especially in weather like this. Though he didn't have the accent of an outsider, sounded local, maybe Yeovil or Gillingham Way. He offered to pay cash up front, said he just needed the tow quick, no paperwork. I should have clocked that, but I was tired, and cash was cash. The garage had been quiet all day, just 2 oil changes and a battery replacement. Jeff had left early for a doctor's appointment, leaving me to lock up. The extra money would help with the electricity bill that had been sitting on my kitchen table for the past week. So I locked up, grabbed the truck keys, and followed his directions. As we drove, he sat tensely in the passenger seat, barely speaking except to give directions. The heater blasted warm air that fogged the windows and carried the faint scent of his aftershave mixed with something sharper. Sweat, perhaps, or fear. I tried making conversation about the weather, the roads, normal things. He responded with nods or single words, his right leg bouncing nervously the whole time. We wound through narrow country lanes, headlights cutting through the darkness and rain. The wipers struggled to keep the windscreen clear as we passed ancient hedgerows and the occasional farmhouse, windows glowing warmly against the night. He directed me off the main road onto a dirt track I'd never noticed before, despite having lived in the area my whole life. It was pitch black by the time we got to the spot. I could barely make out his car, an old Vauxhall Astra, half sunken in the muddy verge beside what looked like an abandoned cottage. The headlights illuminated the scene in stark relief. The car tilted at an angle, front wheel buried to the axle in mud. The cottage beyond, a dark silhouette against the night sky. He asked me to back up and hook the winch, which I did while he stood off to the side, fidgeting with his phone like he couldn't wait to get away. The rain had eased to a light drizzle, but the ground was saturated, sucking at my boots as I worked. The tow truck's engine rumbled, vibrating through the damp air as I positioned it carefully, trying not to get stuck myself. The headlights cast long shadows across the scene, transforming ordinary shapes into something more sinister. I noticed the cottage more than anything. It was old, covered in ivy, windows boarded up, but not completely. looked like no one had lived there for decades. The stone walls had weathered to a mottled grey, and half the slate roof had caved in on one side. A sagging wooden fence encircled what might once have been a garden, now overgrown with brambles and nettles. But the oddest thing was the faint glow from inside, like someone had lit a fire. I remember thinking, why would anyone be lighting a fire in a place like that? Then I saw it. A small twisted bit of fabric lying near the front steps. Looked like part of a blouse, torn at the seams. There were muddy footprints too, leading from the car to the door and back again. Rain had partially washed them away, but the pattern was clear. Someone had been going back and forth. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something about the scene didn't feel right. I asked the bloke if he'd been in the cottage, just casual like. He said no, just got stuck and needed out. But his voice wavered. His eyes wouldn't meet mine, instead fixing on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. A muscle in his jaw twitched rhythmically. The silence between us stretched uncomfortably as I hooked up the tow cable to his car. The only sounds were the engine's idle, the light patter of rain, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. No traffic noise reached us here. We could have been the only two people left in the world. When I started pulling his car out, I noticed the back seat was soaked and the passenger floor was caked in mud. And not just mud, it looked darker, like something else had stained the matting. I'm not saying it was blood. I didn't test it or anything, but I know what I saw. A rusty smear across the light grey carpet. I'd seen similar stains at the garage when people cut themselves on sharp metal and dripped before they realized. He kept rushing me, saying he had a newborn at home and needed to get back. This detail stuck with me later, the casual mention of a baby, like he was trying to humanize himself. I hooked the tow, pulled the car free, and watched as he jumped in and sped off without even waiting for a receipt. The taillights disappeared down the lane, leaving me alone in the darkness, with just that strange cottage for company. The rain picked up again as I packed away the equipment. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else. A sound from the cottage, a creak or a sigh, like old timbers settling. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or my imagination working overtime, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I drove back to the garage, locked up the tow truck, and headed home to my small flat above the old bakery on the high street. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cottage, the torn fabric, the strange stain in the car. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't piece it together. Not yet. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling. The garage was busy with the Wednesday morning rush, commuters with flat tires and overheating engines, but my mind kept drifting back to Wincombe Lane. During my lunch break, I opened my laptop and searched for information about the cottage. There wasn't much, just a brief mention in a local history forum describing it as the old groundskeeper's residence for the Wincombe estate, abandoned since the 1980s when the main house was converted into luxury flats. I drove back to the cottage during daylight. The place looked even worse in the sun, roof collapsing, fence falling in on itself. Wild roses and blackberry brambles had reclaimed the garden, creating an almost impenetrable barrier around parts of the building. An ancient oak tree loomed over the western wall, its branches scraping against the remaining roof tiles whenever the wind blew. The surrounding countryside rolled away in gentle hills, patchworked with fields and copses. In another context, it might have been picturesque, but something about the cottage jarred with the pastoral beauty. Like a rotten tooth in an otherwise perfect smile, I parked up and walked round the back, half expecting to see nothing, but the back door was slightly ajar. The wood had warped with age and damp, preventing it from closing properly. It creaked as I pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet afternoon. Inside, the air was stale and cold, like it hadn't been breathed in years, but there were fresh boot prints on the dusty floor, and in the fireplace, burned clothing. Charred scraps of what looked like tights, a bra strap, and the edge of a denim skirt. Whoever had done this hadn't managed to destroy everything completely. Perhaps they'd been interrupted, or simply careless. The cottage interior was a single downstairs room with a narrow staircase leading to what I assumed was a bedroom above. The ceiling had partially collapsed, allowing daylight to stream through in dusty columns. An old wooden table stood in one corner, its surface covered in debris, fallen plaster, dead leaves, empty beer cans that looked several years old, not from last night. But someone had been here recently. Apart from the boot prints and the burned clothing, there were cigarette butts near the fireplace that hadn't had time to gather dust, and something else. A small silver hoop earring lying near the door, glinting in the daylight. The kind a teenage girl might wear. I left, fast. That night, I reported what I saw to the police, told them everything. The bloke's description, the location, even the weird stains in the car. The officer at the desk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, took notes with what seemed like practiced indifference. She asked if I could identify the man in the lineup, and I said I probably could. His face had been burned into my memory. They took a statement and said they'd look into it. I didn't hear anything for days. I kept checking the local news sites and papers, but there was nothing. Life at the garage continued as normal. Oil changes, tire rotations, MOT inspections. I didn't tell Jeff about what happened. Somehow, putting it into words would have made it more real. Then it hit the news. A 17-year-old girl named Lucy Palmer had gone missing on her walk home from evening college classes. Last seen on the same night, not far from the area. The article included a photo. A pretty girl with long brown hair and a bright smile, wearing a navy blouse that looked like it might match the scrap of fabric I'd seen. The report said she'd been studying for her A-levels, hoping to read psychology at university next year. She'd texted her mother to say she was on her way home, then vanished. I recognized her immediately, not because I'd met her before, but because she had the same silver hoop earrings as the one I'd found in the cottage. The report listed what she'd been wearing when she disappeared: navy blouse, denim skirt, black tights. I called the police again, more urgently this time, mentioned the news article, the matching description. The officer who took my call sounded more interested now. He asked me to come in again to go over my statement. When they found her, it was because of the cottage. They searched it, found blood in the fireplace, some of her clothes buried under the floorboards, and eventually her body, dumped in a covered well just behind the property, bound, tortured, and killed. The well had been hidden by overgrown bushes, its wooden cover rotten but still intact enough to conceal what lay beneath. According to the forensic team, she'd been dead before being placed there. Small mercy, though that was. The investigation moved quickly after that. Police cordoned off the area. Forensic teams in white suits combed the cottage and surrounding grounds. News vans parked along Wincombe Lane. Reporters doing somber pieces to camera with the cottage visible in the background. Lucy's parents made a tearful appearance, begging for information. Turns out, the man I'd helped was her killer. They found his car at a car wash 2 days later, trying to get rid of the evidence. An attendant had become suspicious of how obsessively the man was cleaning the back seat and called the police. By then, my description had been circulated to local officers. When police matched the boot print in the cottage to the shoes in his flat, they brought him in. His name was David Rowley, 35, wife, 2 kids, no prior record. Worked as an IT technician at a secondary school in Warminster. Not the one Lucy attended, thankfully. Just a normal bloke on the surface. His wife was devastated, according to the papers. They'd been married for 10 years, had a 6-year-old daughter, and the newborn son he'd mentioned to me, just 8 weeks old. Neighbors described them as the perfect family. Quiet, friendly, always willing to lend a hand. No one had suspected a thing. During questioning, he cracked, admitted to everything, said he'd been having violent thoughts for years, claimed it all came to a head that night, that he lost control. He'd spotted Lucy walking alone as he drove home from work, offered her a lift because of the rain. She'd accepted, recognizing him vaguely as a school IT technician. But instead of taking her home, he'd driven to the cottage, a place he'd discovered while out walking months earlier, somewhere isolated, somewhere no one would hear her scream. I saw his mugshot on the news, same face, same nervous eyes, same man who handed me cash while a girl lay dead 20 feet away. In the harsh police station lighting, he looked simultaneously ordinary and monstrous. His eyes were vacant, as if whatever humanity had once existed inside him had been hollowed out. The details of what he did to Lucy emerged during the trial. Things I won't recount here, things that gave me nightmares for months afterward. The prosecution argued premeditation. He'd known about the cottage, had brought tools with him. The defense claimed temporary insanity, a psychotic break. But the jury wasn't convinced. How could they be when he'd methodically cleaned his car, burned her clothes, hidden her body? He's in prison now, life without parole. They never found a clear motive, just some twisted, buried part of him that snapped. The closest thing to an explanation came from a prison psychologist who testified about violent fantasies that had festered for years, building pressure until reality and imagination blurred. I had to testify at the trial. Felt Lucy's parents' eyes on me the whole time, wondering if I could have saved their daughter, if I'd checked the cottage that night instead of the next day, if I'd detained the man somehow instead of helping him escape. Rational thoughts tell me there was nothing more I could have done. Lucy was already gone when I arrived at the scene. But rationality offers little comfort at 3 a.m. when sleep won't come. The media attention was overwhelming at first. Local reporters camped outside the garage, wanting the story of the man who'd unwittingly helped to kill her. National tabloids offered money for exclusive interviews. I refused them all. What could I say that wouldn't exploit Lucy's memory or her family's grief? Eventually, the news cycle moved on. A political scandal, a celebrity divorce, and suddenly Lucy Palmer was yesterday's tragedy. But Shaftesbury remembered. The town held a candlelight vigil in the market square. Hundreds came, standing silently as Lucy's favorite songs played through speakers. Her sixth form college established a scholarship in her name for students wanting to study psychology. Her parents, broken but dignified, thanked the community for their support. I went to the vigil but stayed at the back. Couldn't bring myself to approach Lucy's parents. What would I say? That I was sorry, that I wished things had been different. Empty words for an unbearable loss. In the months that followed, I found myself thinking about David Rowley almost as much as I thought about Lucy. What makes a man like that? He'd lived among us, shopping at the same supermarket, drinking in the same pubs, raising children. Had there been signs? Could someone have intervened earlier? Or are some people just born with something missing, some essential piece of humanity absent from the start? I started having trouble sleeping. Nightmares plagued me, visions of that cottage, of Lucy calling for help while I stood frozen outside. I'd wake drenched in sweat, heart hammering against my ribs. Jeff noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the way my hands sometimes shook. He suggested I talk to someone professional. I did, eventually. A therapist in Salisbury who specialized in trauma. Dr. Abigail Mercer, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner. She helped me understand that my feelings, the guilt, the anger, the fear, were normal responses to an abnormal situation, that I couldn't have known what was happening that night, that the responsibility lay with Rowley alone. But the sessions could only help so much. Some wounds don't heal cleanly. Sometimes I think back to that night. What if I hadn't gone? What if I'd pressed him harder? What if I'd opened the door to that cottage before he left? Questions without answers, playing on repeat in the quiet hours. I still work at the garage. Jeff retired last year and sold the business to me at a price I could almost afford, with a bank loan covering the rest. I've hired a young apprentice, teaching him the trade like Jeff taught me. Life continues its familiar patterns: oil changes, tire rotations, MOT inspections. The repetitive work has become a kind of therapy, focusing my mind on tangible problems with clear solutions. I still drive past Wincombe Lane sometimes, though I take the longer route when I can avoid it. The cottage is gone now, burned down by someone last year. Maybe angry locals. Maybe someone who just didn't want the place standing anymore. All that's left is a blackened shell and a few sections of stone wall, slowly being reclaimed by nature. The police investigation has long since concluded. The trial is over. Justice, such as it is, has been served. I get it. Some places should never hold memories like that. Some people, even less. And me, I just wish I hadn't been part of it at all. But I was. I am. My statement helped convict Rowley. My testimony ensured he'll never walk free again. Small consolation for what Lucy endured, for what her family continues to endure. But it's something. Lucy would have been 20 by now. Maybe in her second year at university, studying psychology like she'd planned. Perhaps making new friends, falling in love, discovering who she was meant to become. All those possibilities extinguished in a single night of inexplicable violence. I keep her photo, the one from the news article, pinned to my office wall at the garage. Not as a morbid reminder, but as a promise. To be more observant, to trust my instincts, to speak up when something feels wrong. I couldn't save Lucy Palmer, but maybe, just maybe, the lessons from that night might help someone else. Shaftesbury has moved on in its way. New people have moved to town. New stories occupy local gossip. But underneath the surface, things have changed. Parents are more cautious about letting their teenagers walk alone. People are more suspicious of strangers. The easy trust of small-town life has been fractured. As for me, I'm learning to live with what happened. Some days are easier than others. I've started dating again. A primary school teacher named Claire, who moved to town last year. She knows my story. Everyone in Shaftesbury does. But she doesn't treat me like a curiosity or a victim. With her, I can sometimes go hours without thinking about the cottage or David Rowley or Lucy Palmer. But I never forget completely. I don't think I'm meant to. In my darker moments, I wonder if Rowley was truly unique or if there are others like him walking among us, ordinary people harboring extraordinary capacity for evil. Fathers, neighbors, colleagues, with secret thoughts no one suspects. It's a terrifying possibility that keeps me awake some nights. More often, though, I choose to focus on the aftermath, not just the horror, but the moments of humanity that followed. The police officers who worked tirelessly to build the case, the forensic team who ensured no evidence was overlooked, Lucy's friends who established an annual fun run in her memory, the community that rallied around her family in their darkest hour. Evil exists. I've seen it firsthand, but so does goodness. So does resilience. I didn't know her name that night. I didn't know someone had gone missing. All I knew was that something felt wrong in that place, and I couldn't explain why. Now I know, and I can never unknow it. The cottage on Winkham Lane changed me forever. Not just what happened there, but the knowledge that ordinary lives can intersect with extraordinary evil in the most mundane circumstances. A broken down car, a rainy night, a simple tow job that connected me to a tragedy I never could have imagined. The cottage is gone. Lucy is gone. But the ripples from that night continue to spread, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen, including mine, especially mine. She was watching me through the crack in the wall. For weeks, I'd felt her eyes following me around my new flat. The woman no one would talk about, the previous tenant who'd vanished without a trace. Now I know why the rent was so cheap in one of London's most expensive neighborhoods. Now I understand the strange stains beneath the fresh paint, and now I realize I might be next. My name is Madeline Cox, and I'm going to tell you about the 18 months I spent living in Flat 16B, Cold Harbour Lane, and how I uncovered the truth about Rebecca Walsh, the woman who disappeared before I arrived, the woman whose possessions kept turning up in my walls, and the building manager who knew far more than he was telling. It began with a suspiciously good deal on a Victorian conversion flat in Brixton. January 2019. I'd just landed a curator position at a small modern art gallery in central London. And after 3 months of sofa surfing with increasingly impatient university friends, I was desperate for my own space. The advert appeared in my feed late one night. 1-bedroom flat, recently renovated, private garden access, £900 per month including utilities. In London, this was unheard of. Similar properties in the area went for twice that. I should have questioned it. I should have walked away. But when you're 27, earning barely enough to live on, and sleeping on an increasingly lumpy sofa in someone else's flat, skepticism takes a back seat to opportunity. I arranged a viewing for the next day. Cold Harbour Lane cuts through Brixton like a scar, lined with Victorian terraces that have seen better days. Number 16 stood at the quieter end, a once grand townhouse now carved into 6 separate flats. The facade retained hints of former elegance, ornate cornicing, sash windows, a tiled path leading to a heavy front door. But something about it seemed off-kilter, as though the entire structure was gradually sinking on one side. Martin Ellis, the building manager, met me in the communal hallway. Mid-50s, perpetually damp-looking, with thinning hair combed over a shiny scalp, and a smile that never reached his watery eyes. The kind of man who stands slightly too close when speaking. He jangled his keys with nervous energy as he led me up creaking stairs to the first floor. "It's been completely redone," he explained, unlocking the door to 16B. New kitchen, new bathroom, fresh paint throughout. The flat was surprisingly spacious for London. A decent-sized living room with original fireplace, sealed up of course. A small but functional kitchen. a bathroom with actual full-size bath, and a bedroom overlooking a shared garden. The renovation work was evident everywhere. The place smelled of fresh paint and new carpet. Everything gleamed with that unlived-in quality of recent refurbishment. I should have asked why. I should have wondered about the previous tenant. Instead, I asked where to sign. The rent required a surprisingly small deposit. The paperwork was minimal. Martin seemed eager to have the place occupied quickly. All red flags I ignored in my desperation for affordable housing in Zone 2. I moved in 2 days later, my possessions fitting into the back of a single taxi. Clothes, books, a laptop, and a few framed photographs. The sum total of a life lived mostly in temporary accommodations. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I unpacked my meager possessions, bought some second-hand furniture, settled into my new job at the gallery. My neighbours were largely invisible, the kind of Londoners who avoid eye contact in the hallway and close their doors quickly when they hear footsteps on the stairs. Only Mrs. Patterson in 16A, an elderly widow who'd lived in the building since the 1970s, made any effort at friendliness, inviting me in for tea my second week. Her flat was a time capsule. Antimacassars on faded armchairs, porcelain figurines on every surface, the lingering smell of boiled cabbage and lavender polish. Her walls were lined with photographs spanning decades. Children who had grown into adults with children of their own. A stern-looking husband long deceased. Holiday snapshots from British seaside towns. A life thoroughly lived and meticulously documented. She asked polite questions about my job, my family back in Manchester, whether I was courting. I answered between sips of too sweet tea from bone china cups so thin they seemed almost translucent. She mentioned having seen many tenants come and go over the years. Young people mostly, she said, none staying very long. Then, as I was leaving, she gripped my wrist with surprising strength. They painted over it, I suppose. Her voice had dropped to a whisper. Painted over what? The wall in your bedroom, the stain that wouldn't come out. Before I could ask what she meant, she retreated into her flat, bolting the door with finality. The sound of multiple locks engaging echoed in the hallway. 1, 2, 3. More than seemed necessary, even in London. That night, I examined my bedroom walls with a rising sense of unease. The paint was even, matte white, unremarkable. But as I ran my fingers along the wall that separated my flat from the external fire escape, I noticed a slight difference in texture in one section, approximately 1 meter square, where the plaster felt newer than the surrounding area. I tried to dismiss Mrs. Patterson's comment as the ramblings of a lonely old woman, but that night I dreamed of seeping dark liquid, of paint bubbling and peeling back to reveal something underneath. I woke at 3:17 a.m., the precise time I would wake for the next 18 months, heart racing, convinced someone was in the room with me. By morning, I'd rationalized everything. Old buildings make noises. New paint has a different texture over patched areas. Elderly neighbors say cryptic things. None of it means anything sinister. Then I found the first item. I was hanging a framed print in the living room, tapping a nail into what I thought was a solid wall, when the plaster crumbled unexpectedly, creating a small hole. Frustrated, I fetched a torch to assess the damage, peering into the dark cavity. Something glinted back at me. Using a coat hanger, I managed to hook and extract a delicate silver bracelet, tarnished but clearly expensive. The clasp was broken, as though it had been torn from someone's wrist. I should have gone to the police then. Instead, I convinced myself it must have fallen into the wall cavity during renovation work. I cleaned it up, placed it in my jewelry box, and patched the hole. A week later, while attempting to unblock a persistently slow bathroom drain, I found a clump of long, dark hair wrapped around the trap. My own hair is blonde and short. The hair was at least 30 centimeters long, dark chestnut, and appeared to have been forcibly pulled out. Several strands still had follicles attached. That evening, I finally questioned Martin about the previous tenant. I caught him in the hallway, halfway through changing a light bulb. His reaction to my casual inquiry was immediate. A tightening around the eyes, a twitch in his left cheek. "Student," he said, eyes fixed on the bulb. "Exchange student. Went back to Spain, or maybe it was Italy." He screwed the bulb in with more force than necessary. "Why'd you ask?" I mentioned finding the bracelet. His hand slipped, shattering the bulb. A thin line of blood appeared on his palm. "Must have been left by the builders," he said, wiping his hand on his trousers, leaving a smear of crimson. "Chuck it out." That night, I finally did what I should have done before signing the lease. I searched online for information about 16B Cold Harbor Lane. It took some digging, but eventually I found it. A small article from 13 months earlier in a local community newspaper. Concern growing for missing woman. Rebecca Walsh, 25, had not been seen since December 2017. Her last known address, my flat. The article included a photograph. Rebecca had long dark hair, high cheekbones, and serious eyes that seemed to look directly at me. Around her wrist was a silver bracelet identical to the one I'd found in my wall. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I called in sick to work and began a more thorough investigation. I discovered that Rebecca had been a PhD student, researching historical crime at King's College London. She'd lived alone, kept to herself, but was close to her sister in Bristol. After missing her weekly call with that sister, she was reported missing. Police had investigated but found nothing suspicious. The theory was that she'd left voluntarily, possibly due to academic pressure. The case remained open but inactive. Further research revealed unsettling patterns. Local social media groups mentioned other disappearances from the Brixton area over the years. Nothing that appeared connected, nothing that had generated major headlines, but a steady trickle of young women who had simply vanished. Most had been explained away as people moving on with their lives, cutting ties, starting fresh elsewhere. Several had last been seen near Cold Harbor Lane. I found her sister, Claire Walsh, on social media and sent a message explaining who I was and what I'd found. She responded within hours, her profile picture showing the same high cheekbones and serious eyes as Rebecca, but with short blonde hair, a disconcerting mirror of our own physical differences. We met the following day at a cafe 3 streets away from Cold Harbor Lane. Claire was visibly exhausted, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been grieving for too long without resolution. When I handed her the bracelet, she held it like something infinitely precious and infinitely painful. "I gave her this for her 25th birthday," she said. She never took it off. Claire had never believed the voluntary disappearance theory. Rebecca was dedicated to her research, had just received additional funding, and had been excited about new evidence she'd discovered relating to historical murders in Brixton. The police had interviewed Martin, the other tenants, Rebecca's classmates and professors. No leads. After 6 months, the investigation had effectively stalled. Most disturbingly, Claire told me that Rebecca had mentioned feeling watched in the weeks before her disappearance. She'd complained about noises in the walls, about missing personal items that would reappear in strange places. about a persistent feeling that someone had been in her flat while she was out. She'd changed the locks twice, had considered breaking her lease and moving elsewhere, had begun documenting everything in a journal that disappeared along with her. I didn't tell Claire about the hair in the drain or the patched section of wall. I didn't share my growing conviction that Rebecca had never left Cold Harbour Lane. Some truths are too heavy to place on shoulders already bowed by grief. But that evening, I examined my flat with new eyes. The fresh paint, the new carpet, the replaced section of wall. The renovations weren't improvements. They were erasures. I began to notice other things. The floorboard near the bedroom window that sounded different when stepped on. The section of kitchen tile work that didn't quite match the rest. The slight discoloration on the ceiling above the shower, visible only in certain light. My flat was a palimpsest. Rebecca's existence scraped away, painted over, but still faintly visible if you knew where to look. And Martin's behavior grew increasingly erratic. I'd catch him watching me from the garden when I left for work. He invented reasons to check my smoke alarms, my radiators, my windows. Once, returning unexpectedly after forgetting my access card for the gallery, I found him standing in my living room, seemingly doing nothing at all. He claimed he was investigating a leak from the flat above. There was no leak, and the flat above had been empty for months. I began documenting everything. I took photographs of every unusual feature in the flat. I recorded the times Martin appeared without explanation. I noted every unexplained sound, every misplaced object, every strange smell. I created a detailed floor plan, marking areas where the renovation seemed most recent or most thorough. And I researched Rebecca Walsh's research. Through academic databases, I found her published work on historical crimes in South London, particularly a series of unsolved murders in Brixton between 1889 and 1891. 4 young women, all tenants of the same boarding house, all found with their throats cut and peculiar items sealed inside their body cavities. Buttons, coins, locks of hair. The killer was never identified, but Rebecca had been pursuing a theory that the boarding house owner, one Martin Ellis Sr., had been responsible. The contemporary Martin Ellis was his great-grandson. That connection should have sent me to the police immediately. Instead, motivated by some misguided sense that I needed more evidence, I decided to investigate further. I contacted Rebecca's academic supervisor, who confirmed her research had taken an unexpected turn in her final weeks. She discovered documents suggesting the historical Martin Ellis hadn't died in 1892, as previously believed, but had changed his name and continued running boarding houses in various London neighbourhoods, each associated with disappearances that were never connected to him. She became quite obsessed, the supervisor told me. She was convinced there was a family pattern, that something had been passed down through generations. I told her she was straying into unprovable territory, that it would damage her academic credibility. The original boarding house, I discovered with growing horror, had stood at the exact location of 16 Cold Harbour Lane. Through public records and extensive genealogical research, I traced the Ellis family history. Martin Ellis Sr. had 5 children. 3 sons continued the family business of property management across different parts of London. Their children did the same. The current Martin Ellis was the last male descendant of the original boarding house owner, inheriting properties that had remained in family hands for generations. I discovered something else too. Every property managed by an Ellis had experienced at least one unexplained disappearance per decade. Young women, usually living alone, often students or newly arrived in London. Each case investigated separately. each eventually filed away as a voluntary departure or possible suicide. None ever connected to the Ellis family, none ever solved. Around this time, about 6 months into my tenancy, I began to feel watched not just by Martin, but by someone else. I'd wake at exactly 3:17 a.m. with the certainty that someone was standing in the darkest corner of my bedroom. Objects would move slightly between when I left for work and when I returned. The silver bracelet, which I'd kept after Claire couldn't bear to take it, repeatedly migrated from my jewelry box to my bedside table. I began to fear I was losing my grip on reality. Was I inventing connections because of Rebecca's research? Was I experiencing the same paranoia that might have driven her to leave suddenly? Or was something more sinister at work? The fear became physical. I lost weight, developed insomnia, jumped at every noise, started leaving lights on all night, wedged chairs against my door when sleeping. I was living in a constant state of heightened awareness that left me exhausted but unable to relax. I considered moving out, but my meager salary and London's impossible rental market meant I had nowhere else to go. Besides, a part of me felt responsible to Rebecca, to learn what had happened, to ensure she wasn't simply forgotten, written off as another young woman who couldn't handle the pressures of life. The turning point came 9 months into my tenancy. A thunderstorm had knocked out power to the building. As I fumbled with candles, one rolled under the bed. Reaching for it, my fingers found a loose floorboard. Prying it up revealed a small cavity containing a notebook, Rebecca's research journal. The final entry, dated December 14th, 2017, read, M. Watching constantly. Found keys missing again. Located murder weapon in basement storage area. Photographed and documented. Evidence conclusive of familial pattern. Going to police tomorrow morning. There was no entry for December 15th. Rebecca had disappeared on the night of December 14th. The journal detailed her growing certainty that Martin Ellis was following in his ancestors' footsteps. She tracked a pattern of disappearances. Young women who had rented flats or rooms in properties managed by the Ellis family over generations. Never enough from a single property to raise suspicion. Always explained away as people moving on. She'd identified 17 potential victims dating back to 1952. And she'd found something in the basement. The basement of 16 Cold Harbour Lane was officially condemned, deemed structurally unsound after subsidence in the 1990s. I'd never seen the door unlocked, but according to Rebecca's journal, Martin kept it accessible and used it for storage. Rebecca described discovering a hidden room within the basement, accessed through a false wall behind old shelving units. Inside, she'd found items belonging to missing women dating back decades. Driver's licenses, jewelry, clothing, all meticulously preserved and labeled. And something else. A collection of antique surgical tools passed down through generations of the Ellis family, one of which, a particular curved knife, matched descriptions of the weapon used in the 1889 to 1891 killings. Most disturbing of all were the photographs. According to Rebecca's journal, she'd found albums containing pictures of women in various stages of what she described as ceremonial preparation. The journal didn't elaborate, but her academic articles on the historical murders detailed how victims were prepared before death. Bathed, dressed in white, positioned in specific poses meant to mimic classical paintings of sleeping women. I called Claire immediately, sharing what I'd found. She urged me to go to the police. I agreed to meet her the next morning at the local station, journal in hand. That night, the power went out again. No storm this time. Just my flat, plunged into darkness at 11:42 p.m. I reached for my phone to use as a torch, but it was dead, fully charged moments before, now completely unresponsive. The spare torch in my bedside drawer was missing. The candles had mysteriously disappeared, and from the hallway outside my flat came the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. I didn't wait to see who would enter. Grabbing Rebecca's journal, I locked myself in the bathroom, the only room with a window large enough to climb through. As I heard my front door open, I forced the bathroom window sash up and squeezed out onto the narrow fire escape. The metal was slick with rain, my bare feet struggling for purchase. Below, the garden was pitch black. Above, the windows of the upper flats showed no lights, no witnesses. I climbed upward, reasoning that the roof offered more escape options than the garden, where I'd be trapped by high walls. I had reached the top floor when I heard the bathroom window open below. A torch beam swept the fire escape, then settled on my retreating form. Heavy footsteps began to ascend the metal staircase. The roof access door was secured with a padlock, but years of neglect had weakened its housing. One desperate kick splintered the wood around it, allowing me onto the roof. Rain made the slate tiles treacherous. I scrambled across, trying to reach the adjoining building, aware of pursuit growing closer. That's when I saw it, the disturbed section of roof where slates had been recently removed and replaced. The exact spot that would be above the bedroom in my flat. The exact location of the stained wall that had been replastered and painted. In my moment of horrified realization, I slipped. The journal flew from my grasp, skidding across wet slate and disappearing over the edge. I lunged for it, too late, instead finding myself face to face with Martin Ellis, silhouetted against the night sky, something long and metallic gleaming in his hand. "She was asking too many questions too," he said, his voice eerily calm. "About family traditions, about keeping things in the family." The curved knife in his hand matched the description in Rebecca's journal. An antique surgical tool with an ivory handle, its blade gleaming despite its age. He advanced slowly, unhurried, as though we had all the time in the world, as though the outcome was predetermined. "We've been here since before this area had a name," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the surrounding streets with his free hand. "Maintaining properties, maintaining traditions, keeping the family strong. Each generation learns from the last. Each generation improves the technique." I braced for the impact of whatever weapon he held. Instead, from the street below came sudden flashing blue lights. Someone had called the police. Later, I would learn it was Mrs. Patterson, watching from her window as she did every night, witnessing my desperate roof escape. Martin hesitated, calculating his options. That moment of indecision saved my life. He turned to flee, lost his footing on the wet slate, and fell, not to the street, but through the weakened section of roof he himself had previously disturbed. The crash echoed through the building, followed by silence. The police found Martin Ellis impaled on a Victorian cast-iron radiator in what had been my bedroom. When they prized up the floorboards beneath where he fell, they discovered the first of the bodies, Rebecca Walsh, exactly where I had slept for 9 months, separated from me by a thin layer of new flooring. The subsequent investigation revealed the full horror of Cold Harbour Lane. 6 bodies were recovered from various concealed locations within the building. The oldest had been there since 1984. Each had been killed in the same way as the historical victims Rebecca had researched. Throat cut, personal items sealed inside body cavities. Each had been a tenant. Each had started asking questions. In Martin's private rooms in the basement, accessible through a concealed entrance he had created, police found meticulous records dating back decades. Like his ancestor, he had been documenting his work. Unlike his ancestor, he had kept trophies, jewelry, identification, clothing. A family tradition passed down through generations. The basement chamber was a museum of horror. Victorian surgical tools displayed alongside modern scalpels. Antique furniture arranged to recreate the setting of historical photographs. Journals detailing procedures and improvements to techniques pioneered by ancestors. And most disturbing of all, a family grimoire. A handwritten book passed down through generations of Ellis men, detailing their beliefs about capturing the essence of young women to strengthen the family bloodline. It wasn't merely murder. It was ritual, ceremony, religion. Each killing meticulously planned and executed according to traditions established in the 1880s. Each victim selected for specific qualities, intelligence, curiosity, independence, that the Ellis men believed would strengthen their lineage when absorbed through their ceremonies. Claire Walsh attended each court hearing during Martin's trial. He had survived his fall, though permanently paralyzed below the waist. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Throughout the proceedings, he maintained the same eerie calm I'd witnessed on the roof, speaking only once, to correct the prosecutor on the exact number of his victims. The official count was 23, not 17. Further investigation revealed connections to other properties around London, buildings managed by distant cousins of the Ellis family, each with their own history of disappearances. The full extent of the family's activities may never be known. Some relatives disappeared before they could be questioned. Some properties were mysteriously destroyed by fire before they could be searched. The ripples extended outward, suggesting a network larger and more organized than anyone had initially suspected. I never returned to Cold Harbour Lane. My possessions were collected by police, processed as potential evidence, eventually returned months later. I moved first to a hotel, then to a shared house in North London, finally back to Manchester. My curator position was held for me, but I couldn't stay in London. Every dark corner, every strange noise, every unexpected movement triggered overwhelming panic. The nightmares persisted, not of Martin Ellis or his knife, but of Rebecca Walsh beneath my bed, of sleeping directly above her decomposing body for months, of her trying to warn me through the thin barrier between us, of her watching me through cracks in the walls, attempting to communicate what she had discovered. The psychological impact was diagnosed as PTSD. I spent months in therapy, learning to manage the constant hypervigilance, the insomnia, the panic attacks. Slowly, gradually, I began to rebuild something resembling a normal life. I took a position at a small gallery in Manchester, rented a modern flat in a building less than 10 years old, researched the owners extensively before signing anything. Claire and I remain in contact, united by circumstance, by trauma, by the shared experience of having brushed against true evil. We exchange messages weekly. She's finished her sister's research, published the definitive account of the Ellis family crime spanning 5 generations. I haven't read it. Some knowledge is too heavy to carry. Number 16, Cold Harbour Lane, was demolished last year. The land remains vacant. Development plans repeatedly delayed by structural concerns. Locals avoid it. Estate agents can't sell it. The ground, they say, won't settle properly. The foundations keep shifting, as though something beneath the surface refuses to rest. Sometimes I dream of Rebecca Walsh, not as I imagine she was in her final moments, but as I felt her throughout my time in that flat, watchful, persistent, refusing to be erased. In my dreams, she's trying to tell me something, her mouth moving soundlessly behind the wall. I wake always at the same time, 3:17 a.m., the time the police determined she died. I don't believe in ghosts. What haunted 16 Beacold Harbour Lane wasn't supernatural, but the most natural thing of all, the human capacity for evil, passed down through blood, hidden behind fresh paint and new carpets, and a caretaker's smile. The true horror isn't that monsters exist, it's that they look just like us, hold keys to our homes, and wait patiently for decades to continue family traditions. The journal was never recovered, somewhere in the ruins of Cold Harbour Lane. Rebecca's final evidence remains buried. Martin Ellis will die in prison. But I sometimes wonder about the broader family tree, about cousins and distant relatives who might maintain other properties in other cities, about family traditions that span generations, about the weight of blood and history, and how some stains can never truly be painted over. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself researching property ownership records, tracking surnames connected to the Ellis family, mapping disappearances across decades and locations, building my own version of Rebecca's research. I don't know what I'll do with this information, whether I'll publish it, share it with authorities, or simply keep it as insurance against the day I might encounter another building manager with too many keys and a smile that never reaches his eyes. I've moved 3 times since leaving London, each time to newer buildings with professional management companies and electronic security. Each time researching the history extensively before signing anything. My current flat is in a converted industrial building, all exposed brick and steel beams, no hidden spaces, no room for secrets. Yet still I wake at 3:17 a.m., convinced someone is watching me through the walls. Check your walls, know your landlord, and remember, the most dangerous predators are those who hold the keys to the places we consider safe. It started with boredom, really. That's the thing about night shifts. They stretch on endlessly, especially when you're the only one there. 4 years working as a network security specialist for a mid-sized tech firm in London, and I still hadn't adjusted to the isolation. The office building near empty, just me and the occasional security guard making their rounds. The job itself wasn't difficult. Monitor systems, patch vulnerabilities, document any unusual traffic. By 2 a.m., I typically finished the actual work, leaving hours to fill before my shift ended. Most nights I'd read tech blogs or work on side projects. Sometimes I'd watch Netflix with the volume low, one eye on the security monitors. It was during one of these mind-numbing shifts that my life changed completely. Even now, I can't sleep properly. The doctor says it's stress-related insomnia, prescribes Zopiclone that does nothing but leave a metallic taste in my mouth. How could I tell him the real reason? That every time I close my eyes, I see what I saw that night, that I'm afraid of who I'm becoming. My colleague Jamie first mentioned the dark web to me during a shift change. He wasn't suggesting anything illegal, just talking about how fascinating it was from a technical perspective, the way people had created this entire shadow internet. Being in network security, I understood the mechanisms better than most, but I'd never actually explored it myself. Jamie described forums where people discussed everything from political dissidents to black market pharmaceuticals. He made it sound like an anthropological study, observing human behavior when anonymity was guaranteed. That night, I downloaded Tor. just to see what the fuss was about. The first few weeks, I just browsed, mostly mundane stuff, forums for people discussing drugs, some marketplaces selling counterfeit goods, political message boards. Nothing you couldn't find on the regular internet really, just with more paranoia and worse user interfaces. I was almost disappointed. Where was this digital underworld I'd heard about? Then I found a forum called Viewing Gallery. The description claimed it was for discussing real footage that the mainstream won't show you. I figured it was probably just conspiracy theorists sharing grainy UFO videos or something equally benign. I was wrong. The forum was divided into categories, each more disturbing than the last. War footage, industrial accidents, medical procedures gone wrong. Things I wished I could unsee, but found myself morbidly unable to look away from. One category was simply labeled rooms. I clicked it and found dozens of threads with cryptic titles like December Session Number 4 or Jakarta Special Viewing. The discussions beneath were vague but enthusiastic, with users thanking the hosts and requesting specific scenarios for future events. I didn't understand at first. Then I saw a comment. When's the next live show? Last one was cut short when subject expired too quickly. That's when I realized what I was looking at. Red rooms, supposedly live streams of torture or murder that viewers could watch or even direct. I'd always assumed they were an urban legend, something that conspiracy theorists and paranoid parents warned about, but that didn't actually exist. The technical challenges alone seemed insurmountable. How could you stream something like that securely without getting caught? I should have closed the browser. I should have walked away. Instead, I clicked on a pinned thread labeled verification process. The post explained that new viewers needed to be vetted before gaining access to live streams. There was a complicated process involving cryptocurrency payments and identity verification. Not your real identity, of course, but proof that you were a consistent persona and not law enforcement. I told myself I was just curious about the technical aspects. How were they maintaining security? What kind of streaming setup could handle this without being traceable? Professional curiosity. That's what I called it, as I created a dedicated persona and began the verification process. It took 3 weeks. Bitcoin transfers to anonymous wallets. Answers to increasingly disturbing hypothetical questions. References from existing members. I found someone willing to vouch for me in exchange for helping them with some network security issues. Each step giving me plenty of opportunities to back out, to realize what I was doing. But by then, I was too invested. I kept telling myself I would just look once, to confirm whether these rooms were real, and then I'd report everything to the National Crime Agency. The first live stream I gained access to was scheduled for 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. I requested the night shift at work, knowing I'd be alone with secure internet access. As the designated time approached, a private message appeared with a one-time link. The message included instructions. No recording software, no screenshots, viewing limited to 45 minutes. I clicked the link. The video quality wasn't great, deliberately degraded, I assumed, to hide identifying details. The room was sparse. Concrete floor, white walls, a drain in the center, bright, clinical lighting, a metal table with restraints. It looked almost like a film set, too clean and deliberate to be real. A figure entered the frame wearing a plain mask that covered their entire head. They moved with casual confidence, adjusting the camera slightly before stepping away. Text appeared in a chat window beside the video. Welcome to tonight's viewing. 14 participants confirmed. Subject will arrive momentarily. Standard rules apply. My heart was pounding. This couldn't be real. It had to be staged, some kind of extreme performance art or a very convincing simulation. Then the subject was brought in. I won't describe that person in detail. I can't. Even now, months later, I can barely bring myself to acknowledge what I saw, what I watched, what I didn't stop. The host addressed the camera occasionally, responding to requests in the chat. I didn't type anything. I couldn't move. I just stared, telling myself this elaborate hoax would reveal itself any moment. It never did. 27 minutes in, I closed the browser and vomited into my bin. I deleted Tor, ran security scrubs on my computer, and spent the rest of my shift shaking in my chair. I told myself I would report it in the morning. I would find a way to anonymously tip off the NCA or Interpol, someone who could trace the stream and stop these people. I didn't, because I wasn't sure I could report it without implicating myself, because a small, terrible part of me wasn't completely convinced it was real, because most shamefully, I was afraid. 2 days later, I received an email to my personal account, the one not connected to my dark web activities. It contained a single line. "Did you enjoy the show? Your attendance was noted." I changed my email, my mobile number, eventually my flat. I found a new job across the country. I tell myself they were just trying to scare me, that they can't really track me to my real identity. But sometimes my new laptop camera light turns on by itself, just for a few seconds before going dark again. My IT knowledge tells me it's probably just a software glitch. My nightmares tell me something else. I know they're watching me now. I've become the subject in a different kind of room. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear breathing on the other end of my phone line. Or I'll catch a glimpse of someone with a familiar way of moving, standing too still at the edge of a crowd. I've installed security cameras, extra locks, a VPN. I sleep with a cricket bat beside my bed. None of it helps, because I know what I did. I know what I saw and didn't stop. I know what's out there now, hiding in plain sight behind proxy servers and encrypted connections. Here's the thing about the dark web that no one tells you. Once you've really seen it, it never stops seeing you. I've written this as a warning, though I doubt it will make a difference. Curiosity is too powerful. That's why those rooms exist in the first place, because there will always be people who want to see, who need to witness the worst things humans can do to each other. I understand now that the viewers are as much a part of those rooms as the people wearing masks. Last week, I received a small package at my new address, the one no one is supposed to know. Inside was a plain white mask and a note with an IP address, an invitation. They're offering me a different seat this time, a promotion of sorts. I threw the mask away, burned the note, but I know the choice isn't really gone. It sits with me in my flat each night as I check and recheck the logs. It follows me to work, to Tesco, everywhere I go. The worst part isn't the fear. It's the tiny voice in the back of my mind, the one that wonders what it would be like on the other side of the camera. The voice that's been there all along, perhaps, just waiting for permission to speak. I've started locking my kitchen knives in a safe. I catch myself researching remote locations, properties with cellars, soundproofing materials. I close the browser each time, horrified at myself, but the searches become more frequent, more detailed. When my neighbor played his music too loudly last week, I found myself thinking not about asking him to turn it down, but about how no one would hear anything from his flat if the music was always that loud. I stood outside his door for 30 minutes before walking away, trembling and sick with myself. I don't know if what I saw that night changed me or revealed something that was always there. I don't know if I'm being hunted or recruited or both. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know, to understand what these places do to a person. The forums call it the viewer effect. The theory is that watching changes your brain chemistry permanently. I think it's simpler than that. I think watching makes you complicit. It makes you one of them. And once you're one of them, there's no going back to who you were before. Yesterday, I found myself in Curry's examining camera equipment, high-definition models with excellent low-light performance. The shop assistant asked what I was planning to film. I didn't have an answer. I left without buying anything, but I know I'll go back, or find another shop, or order online using one of the anonymous payment methods I learned about. The mask I threw away. Sometimes I think I see it out of the corner of my eye, sitting on my bedside table or kitchen worktop. When I look directly, it's gone. But I know it's here, waiting. Just like I know that someday, maybe soon, I'll try it on. I keep telling myself I can resist this pull towards something monstrous, that I am still essentially good, essentially human. But late at night, when my laptop screen glows in the darkness of my bedroom, I'm less certain. If you're reading this, perhaps you felt that same curiosity. Perhaps you're considering taking that first step, downloading Tor, finding those forums just to see, just to know. Don't. Or if you do, know that you're not just looking into an abyss. You're opening a door that swings both ways, and what comes through might be wearing your face. My mobile is buzzing now with a text from a number I don't recognize. It's an address, somewhere local, and a time. Tonight, I won't go. I can't go. But I haven't deleted the message, and I know exactly how long it would take me to get there on the tube.